Hey, did you know that over 90% of our viewers watch our videos but haven't subscribed yet? If you enjoy these true trucker horror stories, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell. It's free and really motivates us to keep the stories rolling. So sit back, relax, and let's dive into today's stories.
Story number 1. The highway after midnight was a long, low hum, more vibration than sound, a silver thread pulling across the dark. Caleb's rig moved along it like a patient animal, headlights pushing two pale cones into the fog ahead. The road should have been familiar. He had been running this route for years. But tonight the world outside the windshield looked softly erased, as if someone had taken a thumb to the edges of everything and blurred them out of recognition. Inside the cab, things were clear and orderly. The dashboard glowed with sleepy oranges and greens. The fan pushed a constant breath of cool air over his face. The faint rattle of a metal thermos rolled against its holder for the 100th tiny time. The steering wheel vibrated beneath his hands with each gentle seam in the asphalt. The refrigerated trailer behind him hummed with frozen quiet, a steady, low reassurance beneath the truck's deeper growl. Caleb kept his eyes on the center line, what there was of it. The painted stripes vanished into the fog not 20 yards ahead, swallowed and reappearing like blinking eyes. His GPS glowed on its plastic arm by the windshield, a small, rectangular certainty in a drifting world. According to it, he was somewhere in the middle of a long mountain stretch, a corridor of hills and forests and almost no civilization. He knew that meant hours of solitude and no real stops until he crossed the pass. The night smelled faintly of coffee and cold air, and the faint, oily trace of diesel. The cab's windows were rolled up, but he could still feel the dampness outside, pressing against the glass, beating in slow, watery constellations that blurred the reflected gauge lights into soft stars. The CB radio crackled quietly with distant, half-hearted chatter. A voice from some miles ahead spoke about road work. Another complained about the fog like it was a living thing. Caleb listened, but didn't join in. The words floated through the cab like drifting leaves, none of them sticking hard enough to matter. Fog like this had its own sound, its own privacy. It deadened the distant, left only the nearby. It made the interior of the truck feel like the last lit room in a sleeping world. He checked the clock on the dash, 1:12 a.m. His logbook, folded open on the passenger seat, showed careful lines of ink detailing when he'd stopped, when he'd started, the measured rhythm of miles behind him. Everything was in order. He'd had coffee at the last truck stop 2 hours ago. He'd stretched his legs, walked under the bright sodium lights, listened to the night bugs flick themselves against the glowing bulbs. Plenty of rest, plenty of focus. Just this stretch, the pass, then he'd find another place to pull off and close his eyes for a bit. The fog thickened, as if it had heard his plan and decided to intervene. Ahead, the world faded from dim gray to near white. The trees that had lined the highway retired into the mist, becoming suggestion more than presence. Headlights from oncoming traffic appeared not as beams but as sudden, hovering orbs, sliding past like slow-moving stars. He turned the wipers on low. The blades whispered back and forth, smearing tiny droplets into translucent streaks that caught the light. The CB hissed, went quiet, then came back with a faint voice. It sounded far away, like someone talking from inside a closet on the other side of a house. "Anybody copy?" Caleb reached out, adjusted the knob slightly. Static swelled and ebbed. The voice came again, clearer but still weirdly distant. "Fog's bad, you boys. Watch your speed up near the old junction." He frowned. Junction. There wasn't any junction on this part of the route, at least not one worth mentioning. Just a long, continuous ribbon of highway until the next small town. He lifted the microphone, thumb resting on the button, but didn't press it yet. The voice didn't have a call sign. It didn't sound like anyone he recognized. "Repeat that about the junction," he said finally, voice quiet in the cab, more to himself than to the radio. The speaker replied with a wash of static, then silence, as if the station had moved out of range in the space between one breath and the next. He waited, nothing. Caleb set the microphone back into its cradle with a soft click, eyes flicking to the GPS again. The tidy digital map still showed a smooth, uninterrupted line. No junction, no alternate road, just the way ahead. He rubbed at his jaw, fingers rasping over stubble. Probably someone on another frequency bleeding over. The hills could do that, bounce signal around, make it seem closer or stranger than it was. Outside, the fog grew so dense that the darkness felt physical. The truck pushed through it like through cotton, the headlights carving only a small, hesitant space ahead. The sense of motion shifted. He felt less like he was traveling through the world and more like the world was slowly turning under him, unspooling an endless, pale tunnel. He checked the clock again. 1:12 a.m. He blinked, leaned forward slightly. The minute digits showed a small, unwavering 12, as if they had been caught mid-change. He watched the numbers for a good 30 seconds, the road humming quietly beneath him, the wipers whispering back and forth. Finally, the digits flicked. 1:13, just a slow clock, nothing more. He exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and sat back. The GPS beeped softly. He looked over. The map had zoomed out slightly on its own, his little arrow of a truck inching toward a small mark that hadn't been there before. An exit. A tiny curve of road veering away from the main highway, labeled in gray text. Junction 46. That wasn't right. He knew this route. He'd run it in all seasons, in clear skies and in storms. There was no Junction 46, yet the screen showed it, as matter of fact as if it had been there for years, sitting quietly just ahead of him in the fog. He stared at the thin line of the exit road, at the way it curled off into emptiness. No towns listed, no services, just a name, High Hollow. The CB hissed softly, as though clearing its throat. Watch your speed up near the old junction. The earlier voice filtered back through his memory, fitting itself into the quiet like a forgotten puzzle piece. Caleb adjusted his hands on the wheel. The highway felt subtly different beneath the tires now. The hum of the pavement had changed its pitch, just a shade lower, like a different key on the same long piano. I'm tired, he murmured to the windshield, to the blurred reflection of his own eyes in the glass. The sound of his voice seemed oddly small. The signs appeared a moment later, materializing out of the white. Exit 46, High Hollow, 1 mile. The green metal was wet, a soft sheen of reflected light. Droplets clung to the edges of the letters like punctuation. He slowed a little, more on instinct than intent. He didn't remember this sign. Didn't remember ever seeing the word High Hollow lit up on his runs. The thought of a place he hadn't stopped at before tugged at him. A new diner, maybe. A small lot where the fog would press against the windows but not come in. He told himself he would only take a look. He had time. The night was long and the isolation was deep. A warm room, a cup of coffee that wasn't poured out onto linoleum from a chain store carafe, might sit well on this strange, washed-out night. The next sign loomed quick in the fog. Exit 46, a quarter mile, no SERVICES listed. No gas icons, no knife and fork symbol, just the words, and below in smaller letters. Truck's okay. The arrow bent to the right, pale in his headlights. The feel of the highway beneath him shifted again, a slight tilt, a suggestion of terrain. Somewhere beyond the fog was a valley or a slope. The land had changed. He flipped on his turn signal. The soft ticking filled the cab, a small domestic sound in the mechanical hush. The exit ramp slid into view, a gentle curve disappearing into a thicker pocket of mist. The guardrail wore beads of water, sparkling softly. Reflective markers winked like low, patient eyes. Caleb guided the rig onto the ramp. The moment the trailer left the mainland pavement, something subtle altered. The hum of the tires changed, becoming a lower, almost velvety sound. The fog, already thick, seemed to fold tighter, as if he had passed through a curtain. The highway behind him vanished in the mirrors at once, erased like chalk from a board. The ramp descended. He hadn't realized the land dropped off this sharply from the main road. The truck eased down a slow incline, the engine settling into a contented, heavy purr. On either side, dim shapes suggested trees crowding close, their tops lost in the white. A small wooden sign appeared on the right, barely caught in the headlights. "Welcome to High Hollow. ELEV 1982. The paint was old, a little peeled at the edges. Drops of fog slid down over the words like slow tears. The road leveled out after a moment. The GPS, which had been tranquil a second before, stuttered. The map blinked, the digital arrow freezing in place while the world outside continued to move. The screen's background changed from the usual neat, muted colors to a pale, untextured gray. The letters that had shown, High Hollow, flickered, then settled into a blank coordinate readout that meant nothing to him. He tapped the device lightly with one finger. It didn't respond. The truck, solid and heavy and real, rumbled on. Ahead through the fog, a pool of warmer, yellow light began to glow. As he approached, its shape resolved. A building set back slightly from the road, square and low, with a line of angled parking spaces for cars and a longer gravel shoulder for trucks. A sign rose up from a metal pole, its edges rusty but its neon intact, glowing steady and unwavering despite the moisture. Mile 46 Diner. Open 24 hours. The letters hummed faintly, a soft electrical buzz cutting through the muffled world. Something stirred in Caleb's mind. A tiny pinch of recognition, there and gone so quickly he wasn't sure if he'd imagined it. Maybe he'd stopped here once, long ago, on a different run. Maybe it had been daylight, and the place had looked like any other roadside diner instead of an island of light in an endless white sea. He pulled onto the gravel, feeling the subtle crunch beneath the tires. No other trucks sat along the shoulder, no cars in the angled spaces. The lot was entirely, curiously empty, as if the diner were lit for no one at all. He set the brake with a practiced motion. The parking lights stayed on, painting the fog around the truck in a dim orange. For a moment he just sat there, hands resting on the wheel, listening. Outside, the faint hiss of the fog brushing against the metal skin of the trailer, as though the night itself were leaning in to listen. Farther away, nothing. No passing traffic, no distant dog, no wind moving through the trees. Only the steady whisper of moisture, the low, ongoing song of the idling engine. Inside, the tick of the cooling vents, the quiet click of the dash settling, the sound of his own breathing. He cut the engine. The world nudged in closer at once. Silence flowed in through the walls of the cab, thick and soft, disturbed only by the ticking of hot metal beginning to cool. He hesitated, fingers resting on the key in the ignition, then slid it out and pocketed it. The cab light came on automatically, bathing the small space in gentle yellow. His logbook lay open where he'd left it. The last written time, 1:12 a.m. He checked his watch out of habit, 2:03 a.m. He couldn't remember the hour that sat between those numbers. Couldn't recall anything but fog and road and the quiet pull of curiosity. It left a small, hollow ache under his ribs, an absence where memory should be. He told himself it was the monotony of the drive. Hours could slip away when the world looked like this. He pulled on his jacket, feeling the familiar weight settle over his shoulders. The fabric smelled faintly of coffee and road dust and the ghost of meals taken alone. He opened the door. Cold, damp air flowed in, smelling of wet leaves and something faintly metallic, like old coins. The step down from the cab to the ground felt higher than usual, as if the truck sat on a slightly different height of earth. Gravel crunched under his boots, each stone pressing through the soles in a precise, individual way. The fog lay thick across the lot, swirling around his legs as he walked. The diner's windows were bright rectangles ahead, glowing gold. Through the glass, he could see booths, a counter lined with stools, a pie case with reflective domes. No movement, no silhouettes. The bell over the door chimed when he pushed it open. The sound was sweet, a little old-fashioned, a tone that belonged to a decade before this one. Warmth greeted him, immediate and comforting. The air was thick with the smell of coffee, frying oil, something sugary, and an undercurrent of disinfectant that gave the room a strangely timeless cleanliness, as if it had just been wiped down, or always was. Inside, the diner could have been a photograph from a worn postcard. Red vinyl booths, their edges patched neatly with black tape. A polished counter with cream-colored stools fixed to the floor by chrome stands. Glass sugar shakers and metal napkin dispensers lined up with geometric precision. A jukebox in the corner, its plastic panels glowing softly with faded color. Behind the counter stood a woman in a pale blue uniform. Her hair was pinned up in a practiced twist, and a white apron was tied around her waist with a careful bow. She looked up as he entered, and a small, polite smile curved her mouth, as if she had been expecting someone but wasn't entirely surprised it was him. "Cold night," she said. Her voice was smooth, unhurried, carrying easily across the quiet room. "Fog's thick," Caleb replied, the words sounding louder than he meant them to. "Fog does that up here," she said, reaching automatically for a mug. "Coffee." "Please." He chose a booth by the window, though there wasn't much to see beyond the glass but his own faint reflection and the soft press of white. The vinyl sighed under his weight. The table's surface was cool and faintly textured under his fingers, worn but not cracked. The woman poured coffee from a glass pot. The liquid steamed, rich and dark, filling the space between them with a more tangible warmth. "Passing through?" she asked, setting the cup down on a paper coaster that read in red letters, "Mile 46 Diner, good food, good folks." "Hauling to the other side of the pass," he said. "Didn't know there was a turnoff here." She glanced toward the fog-blurred windows, then back at him. "We're easy to miss." The answer was delivered with a mild, inscrutable tone, as though it were a shared joke he had just joined. He wrapped his hands around the mug. The ceramic was pleasantly hot, the warmth seeping slowly into his fingers. The coffee smelled fresh, just brewed, a small miracle at 2 in the morning. He took a sip. It was good, better than most roadside places. There was something round and steady about the flavor without bitterness, comfortable. The woman watched him with a kind of gentle curiosity, as if she were trying to place him in a mental catalog. "Been on the road long?" she asked. "Feels that way," he said, and the corner of her mouth lifted. A small clock hung on the wall behind the counter, its hands making a faint, repetitive tick. 2:05 a.m. Against the wall near the restrooms, a corkboard displayed pinned photographs. Old Polaroids with white borders gone soft at the edges, newer digital prints curling slightly under thumbtacks. He squinted at them from across the room. "Locals?" he asked, nodding toward the board. "Folks who pass through," she said. "Faces we like to remember." He hesitated, then rose, drawn by a quiet thread of curiosity. His boots made a muted sound on the tile, softened by the thick, almost cushiony quality of the room's air. Close up, the photographs were of truckers and travelers, smiling couples, groups of men in reflective vests holding up coffee cups like trophies. Some were dated along the bottom edges in neat marker. 1997, 2003, 2011. His gaze traveled over them slowly. A man with a thick beard leaning against his rig, the diner's neon sign visible over his shoulder. A woman in a raincoat holding a steaming mug with gloved hands, fog swirling behind her like white smoke. A line of snowplows parked in the lot, their drivers grinning from the booths inside. He felt a familiar, unremarkable sense of not quite belonging to any of these little frozen moments. Just another passerby, one more in a long line. Then his eyes caught on a photograph in the lower corner. In it, a truck sat in the gravel lot. The angle was slightly tilted, the colors a little faded, but the details were clear. The cab was white with a blue stripe. The company logo on the door was his own. A small scrape by the front bumper painted over lightly. He knew that scrape. He had made it last winter on a too-tight dock. The license plate was blurred by the distance, but the pattern of mud on the tires, the faint dent near the trailer latch, every particular tugged at recognition. It was his truck, or a truck identical to it, down to the accidents of wear that a camera shouldn't have captured years before he'd even turned into this lot. Beneath the picture, written in the same neat marker as the others, was a date. 12/21, 2:12 a.m. No year. The backs of his arms prickled, a slow, rising tingling that felt like the skin growing aware of itself. He glanced at the wall clock, 2:05 a.m. The air in the diner changed in a way that had nothing to do with temperature. It felt like a breath held, like a conversation paused mid-sentence. "Find someone you know," the woman asked gently from the counter. He looked over at her. Her expression was mild, polite, but something behind her eyes watched him more closely than before, as if this moment were important in a way he didn't understand. "Truck looks like mine," he said, keeping his voice even. "Don't remember stopping here before." "Roads have a way of bringing folks back around," she replied, "even when they don't remember it right off." He turned back to the photo. The pulled-back angle showed the diner's facade, the same as tonight, down to a crack in the concrete by the front steps. The fog was thick in the image, blurring the tree line into ghost shapes. His truck's windows were dark. No movement inside, no figure stepping down. He searched his memories of nights on unfamiliar roads, faces of servers in dozens of diners, each drawn with less precision as the years layered over them. A place with vinyl booths and a neon sign could be almost anywhere. He realized his coffee cup was still warm in his hand. He didn't remember walking back to the booth to pick it up, but there it was, solid and comfortably hot. The clock behind the counter ticked. 2:06 a.m. "Food?" the woman asked. "Kitchen still open." He hesitated. The idea of lingering at the booth, of letting the fog outside press closer, of watching the clock march toward the time written beneath the photograph, settled into him with an odd heaviness. "Just the coffee," he said, "Roots calling." She nodded, as if that answer too were familiar. He left a bill on the table that was more than enough for the drink. The paper looked a little too crisp against the worn surface, like a new item placed carefully in an old photograph. As he reached for the door, the bell already chattering softly in anticipation, he glanced back once more. The woman at the counter lifted a hand in a small, almost formal wave. "Drive safe," she said. "Watch the fog in the hollow. It doesn't always like to let go." The words were spoken lightly, but something in them lingered. Outside, the air wrapped around him again, damp and cool. The truck loomed in the lot, exactly where he'd left it, its pale sides absorbing what little light leaked from the diner's windows. The neon sign hummed above, reflected faintly on the roof of the cab. He climbed up, the familiar steps grounding him. The cab light clicked on, turning the interior into a small, sealed island of yellow. He shut the door. The softness of the fog outside became more bearable when it was separated by glass. He checked the dash clock. 2:07 a.m. His logbook waited on the passenger seat, the last entry still at 1:12 a.m. He picked up his pen, its weight suddenly noticeable. The ink moved smoothly over the paper as he wrote. 2:07 a.m. High Hollow, mile 46 diner stop. He paused, the pen tip resting just above the line. The words looked strange in his neat, familiar handwriting, as if he were copying them from someone else's log. He started the engine. The truck rumbled awake, gauges flickering to attention. The GPS screen, dark and sullen until now, flashed, then settled. The map reappeared, but the small gray spur of road labeled Junction 46 was gone. Instead, a short, unlabeled line indicated his current position, hovering in empty space. He put the truck in gear, eased out over the gravel, back toward what he knew must be the entrance ramp. The fog swallowed the diner quickly. In the passenger mirror, the neon sign became a blurry, receding shape, then only a faint, colored suggestion, then nothing at all. The ramp rose, the incline gentle but insistent. He could not see the highway above, only an impenetrable white panel where sky should be. For a moment, the sensation of lifting through the fog was so strong that he felt weightless, as if the truck floated up and up with no surface waiting. Then, with quiet certainty, the front tires eased back onto the mainland asphalt. The familiar, slightly higher hum of the highway returned, threading into the cab like an old song. He merged, though he saw no other headlights, no oncoming glow. The world narrowed to the road, the stripes, the fog. The clock ticked over in the quiet. 2:12 a.m. A shiver passed down his back, as if invisible fingers had trailed there. He checked the rearview mirror. The exit sign for High Hollow should have been visible in the diffused glow of his taillights, at least as a dark shape. There was nothing, just more guardrail, more fog, more blankness. He flicked his eyes to the GPS. The tiny arrow moved forward along the highway line as if nothing had ever interrupted its path. No junction, no diner, no hollow. On the CB, Static whispered, "Anybody copy?" The voice sounded familiar this time, not in a general, seen-once sort of way, but intimately. The tone, the cadence, like his own, played back through a muffled speaker. His hand went to the microphone, then paused. His thumb hovered over the button. The truck rolled on, miles slipping under its tires with the quiet inevitability of a dream. He set the microphone back in its cradle without pressing it. The road stretched ahead, a pale ribbon in the white. Behind him, somewhere back in the fog, a small diner might have been glowing, its bell ready to chime at the next set of footsteps, or it might not have been there at all. On the passenger seat, his logbook lay open. The words High Hollow, Mile 46 Diner, stopped, shimmered at the edge of his vision each time he glanced down, present and unreal at the same time. Out here in the hush of the mountains, some places belonged more to the fog than to the map. Some lights were meant only for those who found them at certain hours, on certain nights, when the world was thin, and the road decided it needed a story to tell. He drove on, the cab a small warm cradle in an endless pail, the engines hum a low, steady reassurance. The night did not answer his unspoken questions. It only pressed gently against the glass and listened. Story number 2. The plains at night were a black sea, calm and vast and empty, and Lena's truck was a lone, steady ship sailing across them. Out here, the horizon had no sharp edge. Sky and earth merged into one broad band of darkness, now and then broken by a light in the far distance. A farm, a small town, a lone porch. The highway cut right through, a gray ribbon under her headlights, faintly gleaming with the sheen of old rain. Her rig moved with familiar confidence, the trailer humming behind her like a second, slower heartbeat. Inside the cab, a small cocoon of warmth held the chill of the world at bay. The heater sighed softly. The dash glowed with a soft constellation of indicators and gauges. A tiny pine-scented air freshener swayed from the rearview, barely moving with each gentle bump. Lena rolled her shoulders, feeling the slight ache of hours at the wheel. The way the muscles along her neck tightened and relaxed in a rhythm almost as regular as the mile markers. The digital clock on the dash read 1:41 a.m. Her logbook on the passenger seat, with its careful columns and precise handwriting, agreed with the story of the night. Plenty of hours left to run, a stretch of flat road ahead, a delivery window with room to spare. The radio was on low, turned to a station whose signal wavered in and out with the lay of the land. A late-night host with an easy, unhurried voice talked between soft songs, the kind of music meant more to keep people company than to keep them awake. Sometimes, when the reception dipped, the host's words slid away into a gentle hiss, then returned as if they'd never left. Outside, something subtle was changing in the air. It crept in first as a dimming of the stars. The sky, clear and sharp just half an hour ago, began to wear a veil. Distant points of light blurred, their crispness softening. The white beam of her headlights took on a faint halo, as though the night had grown full of tiny, invisible particles. Fog. Lena watched it gather in the ditches, in low spots by the road, like spilled milk too lazy to run. It sat there, waiting, while her truck rolled by above. In her mirrors, the white pools stretched and merged behind her, knitting themselves together. "Of course," she murmured, her breath fogging a little patch of glass. "Open prairie and we get fog." It didn't bother her the way it once had. Early in her driving days, fog had meant knotted shoulders and wide eyes, every sign and stripe a test. Now, years in, it was simply another mood the road wore. You slowed down, you watched your mirrors, you trusted your lines, and you let the white world slide by. Still, there was something uncanny about fog this far from any lake or river, this thick, this sudden. It rolled across the road in slow motions, tendrils reaching over the asphalt like fingers. The truck lights carved tunnels through it, but the light didn't travel far. The world became small, reduced to a clear bubble around the cab. Beyond that, everything faded into soft uncertainty. The next green sign appeared ahead, rising up out of the whiteness like a ship from low clouds. Way station, 3 miles, all trucks next right when flashing. The yellow light on top of the sign was dark, no flash. The words looked almost sleepy in the beam of her headlights, their edges haloed by moisture. Lena barely glanced at it. She knew this stretch, or thought she did. There was a way station closer to the state line, miles ahead, not here. This sign must be old, she decided. Decommissioned station, maybe, left for someone to take down on some other day that never came. The fog grew a little denser. The radio host's voice wavered and faded, then came back in mid-sentence. That low-lying kind of mist can make you feel like you're driving through someone else's dream. Keep those headlights low beam, folks. You're not alone out there. His chuckle slid into another song. The tune was slow, gentle, guitars like warm water. A second sign rose up. Way station, 1 mile, prepare to stop when flashing. The yellow light above it blinked. Once, twice, a steady, calm pulse that cut through the fog with surprising clarity. Each flash lit the moisture in the air like a camera bulb going off in a white room. Lena's hands tightened slightly on the wheel. She glanced at the dash. Speed just under the limit, all gauges steady. Her permits, documents, and electronic logs were all in immaculate order. Somewhere on some dot map, this way station must exist. She didn't like the way it seemed to have appeared out of nowhere, though, like a rest area you could swear had never been there before. But roads changed. Infrastructure got added, closed, rerouted. She told herself that 100 times over the years when she'd found something new where her memory said there should be nothing. She took a slow breath, let it out through her nose. No reason to feel unsettled. It was just the fog playing tricks, making the familiar strange. The next sign. Way station, a half-mile, open, all trucks. The yellow beacon here was brighter, casting a revolving glow that threw turning shadows in the mist. The light seemed to slow the air itself, every floating droplet catching and turning in the beam. Lena flipped on her right blinker. The soft, rhythmic clicking joined the low hum of the engine, a small, domestic sound in the otherwise vast hush. As she eased off the throttle, the fog pressed closer, dimming the unknown ahead into a blank white panel. The familiar green glow of her cruise control indicator snapped off. The truck responded with grounded patience, its weight shifting almost imperceptibly forward. A narrow right lane began to peel away from the highway, guiding her toward what lay ahead. Reflective markers bounced her lights back at her, marching in neat intervals. Beyond them, shapes loomed in the mist, resolving into low buildings, tall light poles, and long, empty lanes. The way station sat in a shallow dip off the main road, its outline softened by the fog into a hazy, muted silhouette. Lena's headlights swept over the main building as she pulled in. The structure looked like every other way station she'd ever seen, rectangular, practical, unadorned. A row of high windows, a bank of lights under an overhang where trucks would pass slowly by. The fluorescent tubes inside cast a pale glow that flattened everything into subdued tones. Only one thing felt wrong. There were no other trucks. No idling engines, no tail lights glowing red in long lines, no figures in reflective vests moving between vehicles. The wide concrete pads were empty, the far lanes stretching away into nothing, flanked by guardrails that vanished into fog. She rolled toward the lit sign above the scale. Next truck proceed when green. The current display was a washed-out red, stop. A camera mounted on a metal arm turned with a soft mechanical whir, following her approach. Its dark lens looked, for a moment, like an eye trying to focus in dim light. Lena slowed to a crawl, then stopped where a painted line on the concrete told her to. The truck's air brakes gave a soft sigh as they settled. She shifted into neutral, foot poised on the pedal, waiting for the ritual. Inside the station, she could see movement. A faint silhouette behind the glass, someone standing at a console. The red sign blinked off. Green washed over the fog. Proceed. She eased forward, the tires rumbling over metal plates set into the concrete. The cab shuddered, then glided onto the scale proper. The sensation was subtle but distinct, as if the earth beneath the truck had switched to a different kind of firmness. A large digital display mounted on a post lit up, its red numbers flickering to life. 0. For a heartbeat, it stayed at 0, even as she felt the full, familiar heft of the loaded trailer behind her. Then, with a faint, almost reluctant jump, the numbers changed. 78,020. She relaxed a fraction, heavy but within limits. The shipment of machine parts in the trailer had been booked at just under that. Her paperwork matched. She knew because she'd checked it twice before leaving the yard. She was about to reach for the logbook to note the time when the numbers on the display trembled. A glitch, she thought, a flicker in the power. It happened, especially in weather like this, with air so saturated with water it felt like you could drink it by breathing. But rather than freezing or clearing, the numbers began to climb. 78,020, 79,310, 80,600. Come on, she muttered quietly, watching the red digits tick upward in smooth, unnervingly steady jumps, as though an invisible hand were leaning more and more weight onto the scale. Inside the station building, the silhouette behind the glass remained still. Lena frowned, more puzzled than alarmed. Some error, a miscalibrated sensor. Maybe the damp had gotten into the wiring. She shifted her foot, ready to roll forward off the plate, but the loudspeaker crackled overhead, the sound abrupt and startling in the stillness. Driver in lane 1, hold position, please. The voice was flat and calm, distorted by the tinny speaker. It could have belonged to anyone, gender and age blurred out by the metallic resonance. She settled back, waiting, hand resting lightly on the shifter. The numbers continued to rise. 82,890, 85,010, 87,230. Her brows knit together. The truck felt no different beneath her. The suspension didn't complain. No new creak suggested an impossible load compressing the springs. Yet the digital readout climbed as if she were slowly being buried in invisible stone. She glanced at the trailer in her mirrors. It loomed in the white world, its pale sides beaded with moisture, a faint halo of condensed light clinging to its edges. No additional shadow lay on it, no distortion. Lane 1, engine off, set brake. The loudspeaker again. Polite, controlled. Lena hesitated, then followed instructions. The engine wound down to silence, the hum fading into a memory in the small space. She set the brake. The cab ticked in the quiet, tiny adjusting sound she'd heard 1,000 times and never really listened to. Without the engine, the night stepped closer. The fog's hush seeped into every scene. She could hear the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights from the building, like distant insects. Farther off, a high, thin whistle suggested a breeze moving across a structure, though the air around the truck felt utterly still. The scale readout slowed but did not stop. 89,640. 90,110. 90,350. Driver in lane 1, please come inside. The voice was the same, but closer now. It was easy to imagine the person behind the glass leaning toward a microphone. Lena chewed the inside of her cheek for a moment. Common sense said you didn't argue with station requests. You complied. You asked questions politely. Any irritation stayed behind your teeth. She grabbed her paperwork from the dash pocket, stacked it neatly without really seeing it. Her fingers had learned long ago how to find and touch each document without conscious direction. Bills of lading, registration, insurance card, permits. All the proof of her truck's right to be where it was. She zipped up her hoodie, letting the familiar cotton settle around her. The heater's residual warmth hugged her legs as she opened the door. A tendril of cold air slipped in, smelling of damp concrete and a hint of hot electronics. The steps down from the cab carried her boots into the fog. The silence out here felt thicker, more intentional, as if everything nearby were listening instead of merely existing. The station building's door was a short walk away, set into the side of the long, low structure. The concrete beneath her soles was slick but not icy, the moisture a thin sheen that made her footsteps faintly squelching. The glass windows along the front reflected back vague shapes. Her truck, a stretched, ghostly version of her own figure, the glow of red digits hovering on the scale display outside. As she approached, she realized something that she hadn't noticed from inside the cab. There were no other personal vehicles parked by the building. No employee cars, no state pickup, no evidence that anyone other than her and whoever stood behind that glass existed within shouting distance. She pushed the thought away. Maybe they parked around the back, maybe carpooled from town. There were always explanations if you wanted them. The door hummed softly as she pushed it open. Warm, dry air greeted her, smelling of coffee long since brewed, paperwork, and the faint, static scent of electronics left on for hours. Fluorescent light fell over rows of monitors, desks piled with forms, cubbyholes with labeled folders. A man stood behind a counter, separated from her by a sheet of thick glass with a cutout at the bottom for documents. He wore a uniform shirt with a patch on the sleeve, and a name badge she couldn't quite read from here. His face was ordinary in a way that seemed deliberate, nondescript, mild, the kind of face that faded from memory the moment you looked away. "Evening," he said. His voice, free from the tinny filter of the loudspeaker, was deeper but carried the same calm, unhurried cadence. "Morning," Lena answered, holding up her folder. Scale got a mind of its own out there. He didn't smile, but his eyes crinkled a little at the corners, acknowledging the attempt at humor. "Let's take a look," he said, extending a hand through the cutout. She slid the paperwork toward him. His fingers were long, nails neatly trimmed. He spread the sheets out on the counter with practiced ease, his eyes moving over them with a kind of detached attention. As he worked, Lena glanced around. The room could have been a control center in any state. A wall of monitors displayed various camera feeds, highway stretches leading to and from the station, close-ups of license plates, wider shots of trucks easing onto and off of scales. Tiny red and green indicators glowed under each screen. On one monitor, she saw her own truck, captured from above. The white cab, the long rectangle of the trailer, the faint reflection of the scales read numbers on the wet concrete. Below it, another screen showed the same truck from the front, its headlights twin white flares, the fog a soft blanket around its wheels. On a third screen, her truck again, this time from the side, sliding slowly into view as if the camera's eye watched from a shallow angle by the scale. She frowned. Most stations had multiple feeds, but usually they switched between trucks, showing the flow. Here, every active monitor seemed to be looking at her, from different points in space. Her reflection ghosted over the glass of the nearest screen. For a moment, it looked like there was someone else standing behind her in the room, taller, a dim shape at the very edge of visibility. She turned her head without meaning to. No one, just empty air and humming equipment. "Your load ticket says 77,000 and change," the man said, drawing her attention back. "Registered tare weight matches." "Yeah," she said, "that's what it should be." He tapped a key on a keyboard she couldn't see. Another monitor lit up, this one showing only numbers, rows and columns with tiny labels. "The scale reads," he paused as the digits updated, 92,610. Lena let out a soft breath. "That'd be a problem," she said, "if it were true." He didn't nod, didn't disagree. He just looked at her for a long moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Step a little closer," he said quietly. She did. The room hummed around them. He turned one of the monitors slightly toward her. It showed a static image now, frozen. Her truck, seen from above as she'd noticed before. But something had shifted. The edges of the vehicle looked denser. The shadow beneath it was darker than the ones under the marked lines of the concrete. He tapped a key. The timestamp in the corner blinked. 1:41 a.m. "That's when you'd have been approaching," he said. He tapped again. The image changed. Her truck again, same angle but a little more centered over the scale. The timestamp read 1:48 a.m. The shadow beneath the truck was darker now, thicker, as though more layers had been added to it. Another tap. 1:54 a.m. Now the truck seemed almost to sink into its own silhouette. The darkness under it ate more of the light, blurred the edges where tire met scale. Lena swallowed, the sound dry in her throat. "What are those times?" she asked. Her own voice sounded slightly distorted to her ears, as if playing back in a room larger than this. "A sequence," he said, "from the moment you came into range to now." He tapped again. The display split into 4 panes, each showing her truck at a different point in what looked like the same night. In the first, the cab paint was unmarred. In the second, a faint scrape showed on the bumper, the one she'd gotten backing into a delivery bay 3 months ago. In the third, a new sticker on the driver's side window appeared, the one she'd only put on last week. "It logs everyone," the man said, his tone conversational. "Every pass, every stop. Some drivers come through once in their lives, some more." Lena felt a curious sensation, as if the floor under her boots had tilted half a degree. "I don't run this route often," she said. "Maybe twice, 3 times." He nodded, non-committal, as if marking a statement for later rather than agreeing with it. Something on the monitor caught her eye. In the oldest of the images, the one without the bumper scrape, she could see a faint figure inside the cab, her, hands on the wheel, head slightly turned. It wasn't clear enough to make out her face, but the outline was hers, the way her hair fell, the curve of her shoulders. In another pane image, time-stamped months later, different weather, different angle, the figure in the cab had turned its head slightly toward the camera. She knew, objectively, that these were just still frames captured at different instants, but the progression gave the illusion of movement. As if, across the span of time and multiple passes, she had slowly turned to meet a gaze she didn't know was on her. The man followed her stare. "You came through on a foggy night not unlike this one some time back," he said. "You were lighter then. Different cargo, different weight." He glanced at the numbers on his other screen. 81,300. Lena shook her head slowly. "I don't remember that," she said. "I'd remember this station." "Fog does that," he replied almost gently. "Makes things soft at the edges." He shuffled her paperwork, then lined it up neatly again. "Step back outside with me," he said. "I want you to look at something." That was unusual but not unheard of. Sometimes they had you check a seal, or inspect an axle, or confirm a VIN. Still, something about the way he said it made the skin between her shoulder blades tighten. He came out from behind the counter through a side door and joined her on the public side. Up close, his features seemed even more generic, as if his face had been designed not to stick in the mind. His name badge, she noticed now, bore only a number, not a name. He opened the outer door and held it, letting her step into the fog first. Outside, the world felt even quieter than before, as though their brief time inside had sharpened the contrast between in and out. The truck loomed in front of them, its contours softened by the white air. The scale display glowed at its side. 92,210. The number had crept higher while she'd been in the building. "Do you feel any different?" the man asked suddenly. She blinked. "What?" "Inside the cab," he said. "When you were parked, did it feel any heavier, any different from your usual loads?" She reached back into the memory of a few minutes ago. The way the truck had settled onto the scale had felt normal. The subtle change in sensation had come not from weight, but from knowledge, from seeing the numbers climb. "No," she said, "it felt the same." He nodded, as if that confirmed something. "The equipment is very sensitive," he said. "Sometimes it picks up on things people don't." He paused. "Sometimes people carry more than their paperwork declares." The remark brushed the edge of something personal without quite touching it. She thought briefly of the things she did carry that no manifest could list. Missed phone calls, promises to visit that kept being pushed, small worries about aging parents in another state, the weight of miles upon miles of night. The fog curled around her boots like lazy smoke. The man walked forward until he stood at the edge of the scale, just out of the path where her truck's wheels rested. He looked down at the concrete, then at the undercarriage. "You've been out a long time," he said quietly. "Not just tonight." It wasn't really a question, but she found herself answering. "Yeah," she said. 4 or 5 years straight pretty much, out and back. Feels like I live more in that seat than anywhere else." He glanced over his shoulder at her. "Road has a way of collecting that," he said, "little by little." For a fleeting second, she had the strange impression that he wasn't talking about her cargo at all. He gestured toward the truck. "Climb back in if you don't mind. I'd like to run one more check." She hesitated, then complied. The steps up felt no different under her feet, but the cab itself seemed closer somehow, as if the space had tucked in on itself by half an inch. She settled into the seat. The cushion compressed beneath her in a familiar way. Her hands found the wheel almost of their own accord, sliding into the grooves her fingers had worn in the leather wrap. Through the windshield, she could see the man watching her from beside the scale. He raised a hand in a small, precise motion. "Stay just like that," his voice came through the outdoor speaker. "Don't start the engine yet." She sat still. The quiet pressed around her. The fog outside the glass became a smooth, moving wall, its swirls subtle and patient. On the scale display, the numbers trembled. For the first time since she'd rolled on, they began to drop. 91,990. 90,740. 89,620. Lena blinked slowly. The drop was just as steady as the climb had been, a controlled descent. She realized that she'd been unconsciously tensing her shoulders. As she exhaled and let them loosen, The digits dipped faster, as if responding. 88,200. 87,110. She thought of the long, unbroken string of nights. Of the phone she kept face down on the dash while she drove to avoid seeing texts she didn't have time to answer. Of the small, accumulating pile of "I'll get to that later" that sat somewhere behind her ribs. She imagined, just for a second, setting some of that down on the scale instead, placing it on the concrete and stepping away. The numbers kept falling. 85,390. 83,200. 80,910. The man by the scale nodded once, satisfied, though she wasn't sure at what. "Sometimes it sticks," his voice murmured over the speaker. "Sometimes all it needs is your attention to let go." She didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing, just watched. Finally, the digits settled. 78,140. He tapped the side of the display with 2 fingers, a small, almost affectionate gesture. "That's more like it," he said. He walked back toward the building, disappearing into the fog for a moment before re-emerging under the awning lights. Inside again, he took his place behind the glass. She joined him once more at the counter a minute later, the warmth of the room now feeling strangely heavier than the cold outside. He slid her paperwork back through the cutout. On top of the familiar forms lay a narrow strip of printed receipt paper. Weight 78,140. Time 2:03 a.m. Station MM131 eastbound. The letters looked normal. Without knowledge of the earlier climb, no one would see anything unusual. "Keep that," he said, "for your records." She turned the slip between her fingers. The heat from the printer had left it faintly warm. "Is this station new?" she asked, the question sounding too small for the room. He considered her for a moment. "It's where it needs to be," he said finally, "when it needs to be there." Which was not an answer at all. He inclined his head toward the door. "You're good to go, driver. Safe travels." She walked back to the truck, the receipt tucked inside her logbook. The fog swirled as she passed, parting around her legs, closing in behind. The station's lights felt more distant now, even though she was only steps away. In the cab, she started the engine. The hum flowed back into the small space like a long absent friend returning quietly. She rolled off the scale. In her mirror, the numbers on the display held at 78,140, solid and unchanging. The station exit lane fed her gently back toward the highway. No other trucks appeared in her mirrors. No streaks of light broke the white beyond. It was as if she had visited some small pocket in the night that existed only for her, and only for those minutes. As her tires found the mainline asphalt again, the fog seemed to thin just enough to show the faintest suggestion of stars above. The sense of the plains returned, that vast, horizontal expanse holding her gently in its wide hand. She checked the GPS. The tiny arrow representing her truck drifted along the rendered road. No icon marked the way station she had just left. The last service shown on the screen was miles behind, the next one far ahead. Mile marker 131 flashed briefly by in her peripheral vision, a simple white sign with black numbers, standing alone in the mist. On the passenger seat, her logbook lay open. She reached over at a long, straight stretch and wrote, in neat block letters, 2:03 a.m., way station MM131 eastbound, OK. Under the paperwork receipt, something lightly scratched her fingertips. She slid the slip of printed paper out halfway. For a moment, she could have sworn the text had changed. The station name was no longer MM131, but something that her eyes couldn't quite bring into focus. An arrangement of letters that seemed to rearrange themselves every time she tried to read them. She blinked, heart giving a quiet double beat. She lifted it fully into the dim cab light. The print was perfectly normal. Weight 78,140. Time 2:03 a.m. Station MM131 eastbound. She exhaled, a soft huff that fogged the slip for a heartbeat. When the mist of her breath cleared, the words were still the same. The radio host's voice slid back into range, as if it had only ducked behind a hill. Sometimes the road gives us just what we need, even if we don't know we needed it. Keep your eyes open out there, friends. The night's got its own way of talking. Lena set the receipt back into the logbook, closed it gently, and let the truck carry her forward. The station fell behind in the white, unseen, unmarked. Whether it would be there for the next driver or the next version of herself, the road would decide. Up ahead, the fog thinned a fraction more, revealing the faint glow of another town's lights, tiny and far. The miles between filled with the low, steady song of the engine and the almost comforting weight of a truck that, for the moment, felt exactly as heavy as it was supposed to be. Story number 3. The pine forest pressed close to the highway like a dark, patient crowd, its branches heavy with moisture, its needles holding the cool smell of rain that hadn't quite fallen. Diego's truck rolled through it at an even pace, headlights cutting twin spears of pale light into a fog that had risen from nowhere and thickened by slow degrees. The world beyond the glass had shrunk to a tunnel of gray and white, lined with suggestion more than shape. Inside the cab, everything felt contained and familiar. The dashboard lit his hands in muted amber. The hum of the engine was low and steady under his boots, like a big cat purring beneath the floor. The seat welcomed him with the worn, forgiving give of foam shaped by thousands of miles of his weight. The faint smell of coffee, old fries, and windshield washer fluid mixed into a scent he associated with movement and solitude. The digital clock on the dash read 3:07. His logbook, open on the passenger seat, showed he'd been back on the road for just under 3 hours since his last stop. He'd stretched back there, under fluorescent lights and a starless sky, leaning into the cold night air until his spine popped. The memory felt oddly far away now, as if it belonged to someone else's evening. Out here, the only lights were his, and the only sound was the rhythmic whisper of his tires over wet pavement. Diego rolled his stiff shoulders and glanced at the GPS mount on the windshield. The small screen showed his truck's icon inching along a long, curved line of road through green shading. The familiar route threaded through the mountains, connecting one cluster of towns to another. According to the unit, he was in the middle of a 40-mile stretch where nothing much existed. No exits worth nomming, no services, no gas stations, just forest and grade. The fog didn't care about the map. It lay over the road in layers, soft and insistently present. The center line appeared and disappeared in short dashes, pulling him along like a rope. The trees were only shadows now, their tall trunks rising into blankness. He adjusted his lights down to low beam, reducing the bright wall of reflection. The effect was subtle but helpful. The tunnel grew a bit longer, the edges a little less harsh. The CB radio, mounted just above his head, crackled gently with the sound of distant carriers and half-formed words. Channel 19 was quiet tonight. Whatever other trucks were out here had their minds on their own miles, or their radios turned down low like his. He lifted one hand from the wheel and flexed his fingers. The callus along his palm scraped lightly against the leather wrap. Windshield wipers whispered back and forth at their lowest setting, clearing the fine mist that settled faster than true rain. He was not sleepy, not exactly. The coffee from the last stop still warmed his veins, and the slow pull of the truck over the grades kept a polite level of alertness engaged. But there was a softness at the edges of his awareness, a dreamlike quality to the fog and the rhythmic sound that felt almost like being swayed. Somewhere ahead, a curve sign emerged from the gray, its bright yellow muted by moisture. He eased off the throttle slightly, letting the truck's momentum adjust. The CB popped, then snapped into clearer sound. Southbound at mile 212, you'll want the left lane. Right lane's got standing water in the dip. Won't see it till you're in it. The voice was calm, matter-of-fact, with the faintest rasp of someone who spoke into a mic more often than not. No call sign, no breaker, just the information dropped like a small stone into a quiet pond. Diego frowned. His hand went to the CB out of habit, adjusting the squelch. He glanced at the mile marker as it slid by on his left. 210. Appreciate it, he said, thumb pressing the talk button, words moving more from habit than intent. Who's calling it up there? Static answered, soft and even. No voice came back. The radio settled into its gentle hiss again, as if that brief clarity had been a passing breeze. He stared at it for a moment, then let his gaze return to the road. Maybe the driver who'd called the warning had already rolled far enough ahead that the hills had eaten his signal. Up here, sound traveled strangely, bouncing off slopes, dropping into valleys. 2 miles later, the grade dipped more sharply. The fog thickened further, as though weight had gathered in this hollow. Trees arched around the road, their upper branches entirely lost. The world shrank to the few yards of wet asphalt before him. He nudged the wheel. The lanes curved gently left. There, just where the yellow advisory signs posted speed would have changed, the pavement in the right lane wore a flatter, darker sheen. Even from his vantage point, he could see the slight shimmering difference. A shallow pool had gathered there, shimmering with a dull, glassy surface that didn't belong on the road. He was already in the left lane, following the quiet suggestion of the anonymous voice. His trailer remained steady behind him. No splash hit the undercarriage. No tug pulled the steering wheel out of his hands. The pool slipped by on his right. In his mirror, its reflection of his taillights gleamed briefly, then fuzzed out into white. Coincidence, he told himself. Common sense. Anyone who'd driven this stretch more than once could have told him about that low spot. Still, the timing had been tidy. He flipped through a couple of channels out of idle curiosity. 17, a faint conversation about a storm hundreds of miles away. 21, dead quiet. 19, the usual low murmur, no obvious source for the earlier warning. He went back to 19 and let the radio settle. The clock on the dash clicked to 3:12 a.m. Ahead, the road climbed. The truck's engine note rose slightly, deepening. The fog around the cab glowed dimly in his headlights, each droplet catching and releasing the light in microscopic flashes. The next sign appeared more abruptly, barely 40 yards ahead before it resolved fully. Bridge 1 mile, possible ice. The air through the vent was cool but not freezing. The outside temperature reading on the dash hovered just above the point where he worried. The road itself, though wet, didn't shine with that particular, dangerous gleam. He eased his speed down a touch out of respect for the sign and habit. The truck responded with a minor shift in tone. The CB crackled again. Northbound, that bridge at 2-13 is slick on the left. Stay center if you can. Diego Rightquote's hand paused halfway to the coffee thermos. Copy, he said after a heartbeat. Who's calling that? Again, no call sign. No chatter, just the one piece of information. The voice sounded eerily like the first, same pitch, same careful, unhurried diction. If it was a different driver, their cadence was nearly identical. He glanced at the marker as it came up. 213. The bridge emerged out of the fog as a darker gap in the monotone. Guardrails, slick with moisture, rose on either side. The surface of the span wore a faintly lighter stripe where countless tires had passed, wearing away the film of moisture that sat colder than road. He guided the truck so its wheels rode the center of his lane, straddling that stripe. As his front axle met the bridge, the steering wheel gave the tiniest twitch. The left half of the lane had a softer, less grippy feel, subtle enough that, had he not been warned, he might have chalked it up to his imagination. The bridge slid under and behind him in a handful of seconds. On the other side, the asphalt felt reassuringly normal again. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and set his coffee cup back without drinking. The warmth from the paper cup seeped into his palm anyway. The radio was quiet. He drove on. The miles ticked by in small, measured increments. The fog preserved the sense that he wasn't really moving at all, that the road was an endless treadmill carrying different painted signs and mile markers past his windows, while he remained in exactly the same circle of illuminated air. He tried a few times to raise whoever had given the warnings. Northbound at 220, you still on. Appreciate the heads -up. Static. Breaker 1-9. Mystery weather watcher out here tonight, you got a handle. The only reply was the gentle rush of the carrier, and a faint, distorted echo of his own voice, as though the sound had bounced off some distant hillside and returned thinner. He shook his head, the corners of his mouth lifting in a humorless little smile. Maybe he was tireder than he thought. Fog always made the world feel a bit unreal, as if something just behind the visible was watching. The digital clock slid to 3:19. The GPS pinged quietly. The road on the display approached a long, looping series of curves. The line on the map looked like a lazy signature, winding around some topographical feature the manufacturer had shaded in pale green. In real life, those curves rose and fell through dense forest. Turnouts cropped up here and there along the shoulder, small gravel patches where a driver could pull off, check straps, or breathe. He saw one ahead, a darker smudge off to the right that resolved into a widened shoulder, a trash can, and a small wooden sign he couldn't yet read. The voice came again, this time closer, clearer. Northbound at mile 218, don't take that first turnout on your right. Fog sits funny in there. He hadn't touched the CB. His hand shifted toward it on instinct. Were you sitting, friend? Diego asked. You ahead of me, behind. Static greeted him again, thick and full. The earlier words hung in the air of the cab, as fresh as if someone had whispered them in his ear. The turnout drew, even with his front bumper. He let his eyes flick toward it. The patch of gravel and packed dirt lay just off the white line, bordered by a few scrubby bushes and a narrow strip of trees. The fog within that little hollow did seem denser somehow. It swirled more, its motions visible even in the short glance he gave it. The tall pines just beyond it were entirely swallowed, invisible. He passed it by, his wheels staying on the main lane. A small shiver walked up his arms, nothing severe, just the nervous excitement that came when coincidence started to feel like something more. The thought came unbidden, but logical enough. Maybe there was a trooper out here running a hidden weather station, watching conditions and calling them out for the handful of truckers braving this stretch. That would explain the anonymity, the lack of friendly chatter. Only the tone of the warnings had been personal. Each one aimed exactly at his position, his direction, his side of the road, as if whoever spoke could see him, not just some generic northbound. Mile marker 218 slipped past in the fog's dull glow. The next 10 minutes smoothed into a blur of curves and brief, straight stretches. The truck leaned gently through the turns. The engine worked and relaxed in a long, slow rhythm. Somewhere amid those minutes, a feeling crept in, the distinct sensation of being watched, not by something hostile, not by anything he could name, but by an attention that matched his pace. Every time he checked his mirror, he expected to see headlights behind him that had come up quietly. Every time he crested a hill, he expected red taillights ahead. Nothing, only his own beams reaching into the gray, and the faint reflected glow where the fog caught them. The CB crackled softly. No words this time, just a brief upswell of static that carried the shape of speech but not its detail. His own reflection in the driver's side window looked pale. The dim dash light outlined his jaw, the line of nose and brow. For a second, His reflected mouth moved a fraction out of sync with his actual voice as he muttered something under his breath. He blinked and they realigned. "Weird night," he said. The cab, steady and familiar, did not disagree. The clock turned to 3:27. The GPS screen dimmed momentarily, then brightened. A faint exclamation mark icon appeared at the very edge of the map ahead of his position, too small to tap without taking his eyes off the road for more than a heartbeat. He left it alone, letting the truck's headlights define his reality instead. The hills around the highway rose a bit here, turning the road into a shallow trench. The fog settled into it more heavily. It felt like driving through the bottom of an old, drained canal, the world reduced to high, fatting sides and a ceiling of thick, luminous gray. The voice returned without warning, so close it made him flinch. "Brake now, easy, you're coming up too fast." His foot moved before conscious thought could catch up, easing down on the pedal. The truck's nose dipped a degree, the deceleration as controlled as muscle memory. His eyes darted to the speedometer. He'd crept 5 miles over what he'd meant to hold. The grade, gentler before, had steepened almost imperceptibly. A moment later, a new shape loomed out of the fog ahead. The red stare of a traffic light suspended over the road, its sudden presence jarring in the wilderness. Beneath it, a crossroad intersected the highway at a sharp angle. The white stop line freshly painted. He hadn't known any such junction existed out here. The GPS screen still showed nothing but a snaking blue line, no intersections, no named roads. He brought the truck to a smooth, full stop just before the painted edge. The fog pooled and reformed around the light's glow, softening its edges, turning it into a hovering orb. The crossroad itself was a narrower band of asphalt vanishing swiftly into white on either side. No signs pointed to towns, no reflectors outlined where it went. The traffic lights cycled with solemn indifference, red to green, green to yellow, yellow back to red. No car came from either side to justify its work. He watched it go through 2 full rotations, engine idling low, the ticking of his turn signal loud in the quiet. He hadn't signaled, but somehow the switch had been nudged on, perhaps when he'd bumped the stalk in reflex. "Didn't think there was a crossroad here," he said aloud, more to test the shape of the thought than an expectation of answer. "You never notice it the first time," the voice on the CB replied. His skin tightened, a chill rippling along the back of his neck. He stared at the radio, as if it might be able to explain itself. The hand that went up to adjust the volume shook slightly. He stilled it with an effort. "Who are you?" Diego asked quietly. The reply came with no delay, no telltale pause of someone forming words. "You," the voice said, "just a few miles ahead." The words might have been a joke, the sort of late-night, bored driver's attempt at spookiness. Yet the tone lacked humor. It was flat, candid, almost weary. He laughed once softly, the sound thin. "Yeah," he said, "all right, good one." The voice didn't contradict him. It didn't laugh. It simply breathed across the speakers, a faint, familiar exhale. He realized then that the voice's timbre was close to his own. A little distorted by the CB, pitched through metal and wire, but the shape of the vowels, the way certain consonants softened, it sounded like him talking through a recorder played back on old equipment. The traffic light over the empty intersection swung gently in some unseen draft. On the dash 3:30 glowed in calm digits. "Don't turn," the voice said. "Last time you thought it'd be faster." Diego's grip tightened on the wheel. "Last time," he repeated. "I've never even seen this road." A beat of silence followed. Not the silence of a dead channel, but of someone on the other end choosing not to argue. "Go straight," the voice said instead. "Stay with what you know." The light clicked to green. He found himself obeying without quite deciding to. His foot eased off the brake. The truck rolled forward through the intersection, staying on the main highway, the crossroad sliding past on either side, vanishing into colorless distance. In the mirror, the hovering green orb of the light burned a moment in the fog, then dulled to nothing. The GPS beeped. The exclamation mark icon disappeared from the map. As he climbed the next gentle rise, the fog thinned a fraction. The sense of walls fell back. The tops of the trees emerged as jagged, ink-black lines against the low sky. His heart slowed from its brief gallop. The wheel felt solid again under his palms. The engine's rumble reclaimed its position as the dominant sound. He reached for the CB mic, fingers wrapping around it. "You trying to freak me out?" he asked, aiming for casual but missing by a few shades. On the other end, the same voice sighed. "You're doing that part yourself," it said. "Just listen this time, all right." The choice of words lodged in him. This time. He thought of the way stations and diners and rest areas he'd visited over the years, how some of them had blurred together into a composite of vinyl and coffee and fluorescent hum, how others stood out in color and sound despite being unremarkable, how the road had a way of looping on itself, routes revisited, familiar hills climbed again with different cargo. "What happens if I do?" he asked, the question half rhetorical, half genuine. Static filled the cab for 3 long seconds, each one stretching. "Fog's thick," the voice said finally. "Road the same, you just see less of it, that's all." Not an answer, but the kind of statement he might have made to someone more nervous than he felt. He drove, the miles unwound. The mysterious crossroad fell behind, its strangeness smoothing into the mental landscape of the night. The voice spoke up twice more in the next 20 minutes, each time just before he would have needed to react to something he hadn't yet seen. A fallen branch around a blind turn, a patch of gravel tracked across the lane by some unseen vehicle leaving a side road. Each warning was brief, specific, delivered in a tone that mirrored his own when he was tired but focused, talking to himself. At some point, he stopped asking who was on the other end. The words flowed into the space between his attention and the road, slots where his own instincts would have gone if the fog were lighter. When the first pale hint of dawn began to dilute the eastern edge of the sky, the fog responded, glowing a softer, more uniform gray. The trees stepped closer to visibility, their trunks and lower branches reasserting shape. The sense of being in a tunnel eased. Distance returned, shy but tangible. Ahead, a large green sign materialized, letters sharpened by the growing light. Next SERVICS 12 miles. Rest area 5 miles. The idea of stopping, of stepping out into air that belonged to morning instead of endless night, had a quiet pull. The CB seemed to sense it. "Take the rest area this time," the voice said. "Far side of the lot, you'll know the spot." He smiled despite himself. The idea that some forward version of him was out there, remembering this decision from the other side, commenting on it like a story already read, it was absurd, comforting in an odd way. "Got coffee there?" he asked. A soft huff of breath came back. It could have been a chuckle or just a sigh. "You'll bring it with you," the voice said. "We never did trust the machines much." A familiar, quiet irritability stirred in him at the implication that someone else knew his habits better than he did. It evaporated almost as soon as it arose. The remark was right. Vending machine coffee always tasted like warm plastic and old water. He preferred his own, even if it had been sitting in a thermos for hours. The rest area exit appeared, its short lane curving off to the right. He took it at a calm, practiced angle, letting the truck's weight carry them down the gradual ramp. The fog clung to the trees around the lot, but the space itself was brighter now, reflective paint on the parking lines glowing faintly. A few cars were parked in the small loop near the building, shapes dark against the soft illumination from the low lamps overhead. Only one other truck sat in the designated row on the far side, its silhouette hulking and still. He rolled along the length of the truck parking, eyes scanning for the promised spot. The painted outlines of each bay were the same. Concrete dividers here and there broke up the monotony. At the far end of the row, near the tree line where the fog pooled deepest, a single space sat slightly offset from the others, its lines repainted more recently, brighter against the worn asphalt. He pulled into it without quite knowing why. The movement felt, remembered, though he had no conscious recollection of ever stopping here before. He set the brake. The engine sighed into idle, then quiet as he turned the key off. The cab filled with the tick of cooling metal and the distant, hushed sounds of early morning. Some bird, too, committed to its schedule to care about fog, the faint rush of traffic on the highway beyond the trees, muted by distance. On the CB, the channel was quiet. He lifted the mic. "You still there?" he asked. Nothing answered him but the low hiss of the open frequency. A moment later, as if to underline the point, distant static flickered with the sound of some other conversation on the edge of range. A driver laughing at a joke, someone complaining about construction near a town miles away. The mystery voice was gone. Diego set the microphone back into its cradle. His hand rested on it for an extra second, then dropped. He sat for a while, just listening to the silence settle. The fog pressed gently on the windows, leaving tiny droplets that caught the first, tentative light of dawn. The inside of the cab felt disproportionately warm and safe, a small room at the end of a long, dim hallway. He poured the last of his coffee from the thermos into his travel mug. The liquid steamed faintly in the cool air of the cab. He took a careful sip, the bitter warmth grounding him. Out in the lot, the other truck remained a dark shape. No movement near its cab, no flicker of interior light. It could have been empty or home to someone still deep in sleep. He opened his logbook to note the stop. The last entry, neatly written, read 3:00 a.m. back on the road. He wrote 4:01 a.m. rest area, mile 234 stop. As he replaced the cap on his pen, he felt the odd shivery sense that somewhere in some earlier or later past through this same stretch of night and fog, another version of that page carried a different note. Took side road at unknown junction. Skipped rest area. Didn't listen. He would never know what those lines might have led to if they had existed. The road only ever gave you the present lane, the turn under your hand. For now, the truck was still, the fog was thinning, and the night's strange voice had faded, leaving behind only questions and a curious sense of having been gently steered away from something he didn't need to see. He climbed down from the cab to stretch his legs, boots touching damp asphalt that smelled of pine and old rain. The air tasted cleaner here, touched by the first hints of morning. Behind him, high above the tree line, the faintest paleness in the sky promised that day would come, as it always did, washing over whatever the fog and the night had chosen to keep to themselves. Story number 4. The rain had stopped hours ago, but the night still felt wet, as if the air hadn't gotten the message. Eli's truck moved through it with patient determination, headlights pushing twin tunnels into a fog that rose off the blacktop in low, pale waves. Out here, in the long, empty stretch between one small town and the next, the highway was little more than a dark ribbon laid over rolling hills and fields, disappearing into the white only a short distance ahead. Inside the cab, everything was warm, ordered, and humming. The dash lights glowed in muted reds and greens, tiny instruments keeping their quiet vigil. The vents exhaled a steady trickle of comfort over Eli's arms and cheek. His thermos rested in its holder, still half full of coffee that was more habit than need at this point. The radio played low, some distant late-night host talking about nothing in particular, a thread of human sound in the space between the engine's deeper song and the wet whisper of the wipers. The clock on the dash read 2:23 a.m. His logbook on the passenger seat said he was right where he needed to be, ahead of schedule within his hours, with a clean, unbroken line of ink marking out the evening. Another 100 miles or so and he'd pull off for the night, grab a shower, stretch his legs, and fall into the kind of sleep that only came after long, unbroken driving. The fog had started light, just a thin gauze over the road, the kind of mist that softened distant lights into halos but left the pavement clear. Gradually, almost shyly, it had thickened. Now it lay heavy across the land, gathering low in the dips, sliding in pale curtains across the shoulders. The tops of the roadside trees and telephone poles disappeared into it, their lower halves haunting the edges of his vision like half-submerged things. He eased his speed down a notch, more by instinct than by conscious decision. The world had shrunk to his little cone of visibility, and there was no point in rushing what he couldn't properly see. The white of the center line blinked steadily up toward him, a dashed metronome guiding his way. The reflective studs in the shoulder glowed and vanished, glow and vanish, like a quiet heartbeat keeping time with the miles. He checked his mirrors every few seconds out of habit. The fog behind him was just as dense, swallowing his taillights almost at once. No other headlights followed. No red glows drifted ahead. For all practical purposes, he could have been the only living thing moving on this stretch of earth. The next mile marker appeared on the right, half lost in the haze. His headlights swept across it, revealing plain black numbers on white. 87. He nodded to himself, eyes flicking briefly to the GPS. The little arrow that was his truck crawled along the thin blue line, just where it should be, between small towns he knew better by the diners that served them than by the dots on the map. The radio host's voice dissolved into static for a moment as the road dipped between low, fog-filled hills, then returned mid-sentence, as though he'd never left. Eli barely listened, letting the sound wash around him, a comfortable, meaningless presence. Fog thickens up in the low spots, he thought, amused at his own understatement. The truck pushed on, a big, moving room in a world that felt erased. 10 minutes later, the next mile marker rose out of the mist, the beam of his headlights catching its reflective surface. 87. He frowned, just a little crease between his brows, an automatic response his face made when something snagged his attention. Maybe he'd misread the first one. A trick of the light, the angle, the fog. 86 could look like 87 if the paint was old or the numbers were smudged. His brain, half occupied with the curve of the road and the scent of coffee, hadn't really needed the information anyway. He let the thought slide away. The landscape around him flowed by in dim suggestion. A stand of trees here, a darker shadow that might be a barn there, telephone wires tracing faint, parallel lines overhead before vanishing into nothing. The road rose, fell, straightened, curled, all within the limited fog-bound world his lights allowed. The CB radio, mostly quiet all night, let out a brief crackle. A scrap of someone else's conversation drifted through, drivers hundreds of miles away talking about a sports score, a chain restaurant, a mechanic. Their concerns felt small and domestic and reassuring. The channel hissed back into a low, even murmur. He took a sip from his thermos, the coffee lukewarm and familiar. It tasted of stainless steel and long nights and all the miles behind him. The next mile marker stood pale and slim against the right-hand fog bank. His headlights washed over it, and again he saw the same black figures. 87. This time the small frown stayed. He looked to the dash clock. 2:37 a.m. He knew his usual pace. He knew how far apart these markers were spaced. 3 of them at his speed should have taken at least 3 miles, and he'd been driving longer than that since he'd first seen the number. He glanced at the GPS. The map remained calm, untroubled, the blue arrow inching along the digital road. The scale showed that he had, indeed, covered several miles since the last time he'd checked. According to the unit, he was somewhere between mile 90 and 91. He reached out and tapped the screen lightly. The map jostled, then snapped back. No change. Must have missed a couple signs, he said out loud, a quiet reassurance offered to the empty cab. Maintenance maybe, nothing to post. The road curved gently left, then right. The fog smoothed the transitions, made everything feel slower, like moving through thick air. The truck responded the way it always did, a heavy, obedient beast guided by small, practiced movements of his hands and feet. In the distance, or what passed for distance in this wrapped-in-cotton night, a faint glow bloomed. It waxed and held, a hazy smear of yellow through the mist. A farmhouse light, maybe. A solitary porch lamp left burning. The CB crackled again. Mile marker 87's running long tonight. The voice was calm, conversational, as if it were making a comment about the weather. It came through clearer than most recent transmissions, as if the speaker was close by. Eli's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He reached up with his right hand and adjusted the volume knob, bringing the channel into sharper relief. "Say again," he asked. "Mile 87, the voice repeated, unhurried. "Seems to want to hang on to you a while." The speaker didn't offer a handle, didn't give a direction of travel. Just dropped the remark into the space between them and let it sit there. A sign slid into view ahead. Eli's headlights picked out the shape, the pop of reflection. "Mile 87. The words were crisp, the numbers clean. Not a trick of paint, not a misread. He watched it go by, felt the familiar crunch in his chest that came when something he couldn't easily explain reached across the line of ordinary routine. "Southbound or northbound?" he asked the unseen voice, trying to keep his tone neutral. "Does it matter?" the other replied. The sound carried a faint rasp, the kind that came from long nights and road dry air, but there was no accent he could place, no clue to age. The words could have come from someone like him or from someone younger, older. The CB filtered some of the humanity out of every voice, smoothing and flattening. "It does to me," Eli said. His eyes stayed on the road, the hands of the fog closing and opening around his beams. A soft exhale came over the speaker. It might have been amusement, it might have been a sigh. "You're running north," the voice said. "Always did prefer that track." The remark hit him like déjà vu, something both familiar and freshly unsettling. The truck's engine note seemed to deepen for a moment, as if reacting to the weight of the words. "Were you sitting?" Eli asked. "Behind me, ahead." A brief pause then, "Right where you are." The hair on his arm stirred, a subtle ripple any ordinary draft from the vent couldn't account for. He considered turning the CB off. It would be easy to twist the knob, let silence reclaim the cab. But the sound of the other driver, whoever they were, had become a point of focus in the featureless world outside his windows. Another presence, another thread connecting him to something other than the endless road and the steady hum of machinery. He watched the next few minutes roll by. Fog, the pale glow of his lights stroking the pavement, the faint suggestion of a fence line here, a clump of brush there. The road itself felt unchanged under his tires. No unusual bumps, no transitions to a different surface. Only that mild, constant damp. The next mile marker appeared. 87. He swallowed, his throat dry despite the coffee. The clock read 2:44 a.m. The GPS showed that he had traveled. The little truck icon now sat well past the midpoint of the long, lonely stretch. By all his instruments, by every reliable measure, he had left mile 87 behind miles ago. Outside, by the road's own numbering, he was still there. "Sometimes a mile just wants a bit more company," the voice said softly, as if reading his thoughts. He licked his lips. "This some kind of joke?" he asked. "You boys out here putting extra signs up to mess with the night shift?" "No joke," the voice replied. "Though it'd be a good one. Couldn't manage the fog, though. That part does its own work." The glow he'd seen earlier resolved itself slowly into the shape of a small, isolated building tucked back from the highway. A maintenance shed, maybe, or an equipment barn. A single. Sodium vapor light burned outside, casting a weak, golden halo over a scrap of gravel lot. A chain-link gate marked a short driveway. No sign marked the place's purpose. As he approached, the fog eddied around the light, turning the air above the gravel into a pale, swirling soup. For a moment, just as his cab drew level with the gate, he thought he saw a figure standing there, a suggestion of a man in a reflective vest, hands in his pockets, watching the road with mild patience. When he blinked, the shape was gone. The light shone on emptiness. The gate bars were bare metal, no hand resting on them. Mile marker 87's got a little spur road, the voice said. Hard to see in this, easy to miss, easy to take too. Spur road, Eli repeated, his eyes scanning the edges of the highway automatically. There's nothing marked ahead for 10 miles. Not on the map, the other agreed. Not for you, not yet. The GPS remained unbothered. The blue arrow crept along its line, now approaching an implied bridge icon, a thin blue slash crossing the road. Why don't you tell me what you want, friend? Eli said, keeping his voice as even as he could, since you seem to know my mile markers better than the state does. The radio hummed. Static ebbed. For a moment he thought the other might have gone, leaving him here, wrapped in fog and stray remarks that made no sense. You've been here before, the voice said at last. On this mile, on this night. Different loads, different years. You don't remember because you don't bring those pieces back with you. The words settled cold and strangely heavy at the base of his skull. He thought of the hundreds of nights he'd driven, the countless markers and rest areas and anonymous curves. How easily they blurred together in memory. How, sometimes, he'd get a flash of a place he could swear he'd never been, only to find his own handwriting in a logbook proving otherwise. Sure, he said, road got a way of repeating itself. Not quite like this, the voice said. There was no triumph in it, no drama, just a quiet, resigned certainty. The fog ahead brightened unexpectedly, not with morning but with light on metal. A road sign, bigger and more complex than a simple mile marker, began to take shape. Exit 87, Service Road, authorized vehicles only. The arrow below pointed to a narrow strip of asphalt that he hadn't noticed until his headlights brushed it. It peeled away gently from the main highway, curving down along the flank of a hill. The fog above it was thicker, a soft, luminous blanket lying low to the ground. He felt a small, irrational flutter in his chest. He hadn't seen this exit on his GPS, and yet there it was, solid and painted and entirely real. Nobody's authorized at this hour, he said under his breath. You took that road the first time, the voice on the CB murmured. Fog was heavier. You thought it might clear down there. You were tired of not seeing more than a truck length ahead. Eli's hands tightened involuntarily. The memory of fatigue he didn't consciously possess pressing in at the edges of his mind like someone else's dream. What happened? He asked. The voice didn't answer right away. The truck rolled on, coming abreast of the exit lane. The arrow on the sign watched him pass, its painted stroke pointing down into uncertainty. I don't remember all of it, the voice said finally. Some of it's still in the fog. That's where it likes to keep things. A soft shift in tone like a shrug carried through wire. But I know this. You didn't come back up the same way. The CB's hiss seemed to deepen, as if the air inside the cab had grown thicker. Then how am I here? Eli asked. Silence. The question hung between him and the dashboard and the unseen night, compelling and unanswerable. The mile marker, just beyond the exit, stood like a quiet witness. 87. This time, the sight of the number brought with it a peculiar sense of familiarity that went beyond the irritation of repetition. For a heartbeat, he had the impression of another truck, his truck, rolling past that same post in a different layer of time, its driver squinting into heavier fog, one hand reaching toward the signal for that service road. His own hand, maybe, or someone very much like him. He could have laughed it off, blamed weather or an overactive imagination, blamed the coincidence of faulty signage. But the night felt thinner here, as if more than one version of it were stacked up in the same place, their edges rubbing together. Ahead the highway climbed. The fog hung lower, clinging to the rise. Somewhere beyond, the map promised a bridge, a river he'd crossed 100 times before without remark. "Stay on the main line," the voice said, very softly now. "This time just stay." It shouldn't have been a difficult choice. Service roads were for plow trucks and dot pickups, for construction crews and patrol cars. They led under bridges and alongside culverts, places where debris and washouts and unseen hazards hid. Still, the human mind had a way of fixating on what it wasn't supposed to do. The short, sloping lane, vanishing into deeper fog, tugged at some stubborn, restless part of him that wanted to see what the official map did not show. He thought of times in his life when he'd taken the side path instead of the safe one. Sometimes it had led him to good, unexpected places. Sometimes it had cost him in ways he only understood in hindsight. The road, like anything else, offered choices in small increments. The truck's turn signal remained off. His hand stayed steady on the wheel. He drove past the exit. The service road slipped away below, into a thicker, more luminous gray that folded over itself like heavy fabric. In his mirrors, it disappeared quickly, its painted lines swallowed, the sign's reflective face turning black. For a moment, the fog around the main highway seemed to press in harder, as if resenting his refusal. Then, as the grade crested and the land fell away toward the promised river, it eased. He saw it first in the way the whiteness ahead began to loosen, individual swirls forming out of what had been a solid mass. Then, bit by bit, the world opened. Trees along the shoulder reassembled themselves from vague shadows into pines and oaks. The sky above lightened by degrees, a hint of depth returning. The next mile marker came into view. 88. A breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding left him in a slow stream. The number sat there in plain, honest numerals, looking utterly ordinary. Just another post in a long series of nearly identical posts. On the CB, the voice exhaled in tandem with him. "Been trying to get that one right for a while," it said quietly. Eli swallowed. "What are you?" he asked. It was the only version of the real question. Who are you? What is this? That he could frame without his tongue tying itself. "Just what's left of all the nights you didn't quite make the best turn," the voice replied. "Or maybe just you, talking to yourself from a little further down the line. Does it matter?" He stared at the radio. His reflection stared back in the windshield. Lines at the corners of the eyes, faint gray in the hair at his temples, the accumulated markers of long years doing the same thing, night after night. "I guess not," he said, and meant it more than he would have thought. The fog continued to thin. Off to the east, the sky began to blush with the faintest suggestion of dawn, a pale wash pushing at the edges of the darkness. The bridge over the river unfolded ahead, its railings beaded with moisture, its surface dull and wet but not slick. He rolled across it without incident. Water flowed invisibly beneath him, hidden by fog hovering low over the river's surface, but he could hear it distantly, a soft, constant rush, a different kind of movement than the truck. On the far side, the land rose again toward gentler ground. The mist broke into patches, then into tattered strands, clinging to the low places and the shaded hollows. The CB crackled one last time. "Keep to the main line when you can," the voice said. "You'll still get where you're going, fog or no fog." The advice was so simple it almost sounded trite, but something about the way it was spoken, a quiet earnestness, a familiarity with his particular kind of stubbornness, lent it weight. "Copy that," Eli said. "You sticking around?" Static, a faint, distant chatter from other drivers, their conversations small and ordinary, talk of breakfast stops and fuel prices and home. The peculiar, personal presence he'd felt on the channel a moment ago had slipped away, leaving only the usual night sounds. He drove on. Mile marker 89 appeared, then 90, each one a plain little assurance that the world had returned to its regular, counted self. His GPS agreed. The digital map and the roadside posts were back in harmony. On the passenger seat, his logbook waited. When he next had a straight, clear stretch, he reached over and noted the time. 2:58 a.m. Then, after a small pause, he added on the next line, "Heavy fog around MM 87. Stay on Main." His handwriting looked a little smaller there, as if he weren't entirely sure why he was recording it, only that some part of him might need to read those words again, someday, from the other side of some future night. Outside, the first soft hint of dawn strengthened, turning the sky from ink to washed-out blue at the far edge of the world. The fog, grudgingly, began to retreat into the low places, into the ditches and hollows and riverbanks where it could bide its time until another night. In the cab, the air felt clearer. The road ahead no longer seemed endless, just long. The engine's hum was the same as it had been an hour before, but it sounded less like isolation and more like company. Behind him, somewhere in the rolling land he'd left, a short strip of unnamed asphalt curved away from the highway and disappeared into thicker fog, a service road for authorized vehicles only, or for whatever else chose to travel there. It would wait, quiet and unremarked, until the next time mile marker 87 decided it wanted someone's company for a little longer. For now, Eli stayed on the main line, hands steady, eyes on the light slowly growing at the edge of the sky, letting the miles come to meet him one honest, numbered post at a time. Story number 5. The ocean was only a suggestion tonight, a low, distant presence beyond the guardrail, more sound and smell than anything she could see. Mara's truck moved along the coastal highway like a slow, deliberate animal, its headlights pushing two pale beams into a fog that seemed to rise straight out of the black water and onto the road. On clear nights, this stretch was all sweeping curves and open views, the kind of route drivers bragged about on days off. Tonight it was a narrow corridor suspended in blankness, the outside world erased beyond a few truck lengths. Inside the cab, there was warmth, order, and a faint, persistent smell of strong coffee. The defroster breathed steadily over the bottom of the windshield, keeping a narrow, clear arc just above the wipers. The dashboard glowed in soft greens and ambers, gauges holding their needles at familiar, reassuring angles. Mara's thermos sat in its cradle, metal warm against the back of her fingers each time she reached for it. The seat enveloped her with the subtle give and creak of foam and springs that knew her weight. The digital clock on the dash read 1:58. Her logbook on the passenger seat, open to a page filled with tidy columns, showed she was well within her hours, comfortably on time for the morning drop. This late, traffic was a memory. The last taillights had dropped away almost an hour ago, and no new headlights had appeared in her mirrors since. The fog had begun as a light marine layer before midnight, drifting lazily in from the water, smudging the horizon. Now it lay like a living thing along the cliffs, pressing in low and thick, swaddling the road in a softness that felt both intimate and unnerving. It glowed faintly under her lights, the droplets in it catching and re-releasing the beams in a million tiny, patient flashes. Mara sipped her coffee, the bitterness cutting through the cottony feel in her mouth. The cab hummed gently around her, a small, well-lit room moving through a world that had set everything else aside for the night. The GPS mounted on the windshield showed a curling line of road hugging the contour of the coast. The little arrow that was her truck crept northward, past names that meant little to her except as waypoints. Small towns tucked back from the water, campgrounds, overlooks. According to the map, she had about 30 miles of this winding, cliff-edge highway before the route bent inland toward more stable, less dramatic ground. She adjusted her grip on the wheel, feeling the subtle vibration of the tires over damp asphalt. Somewhere beyond the wall of white on her left, waves moved in slow, heavy breaths against rock. Now and then, when the wind shifted, The low bellow of a foghorn reached her, deep and mournful, sounding from a point in the dark she couldn't place. The first mile marker slid into view on the right, its reflector winking back at her. Mile 142. She registered the number without much conscious thought. It was a mile like any other, one of hundreds threaded along the country's edges and interiors to measure distance in neat segments. Beside the marker, faint in the headlights, something else caught her eye. On the concrete base of the sign, just above where it met the ground, someone had painted a small blue symbol, a circle with 3 short lines radiating from its right side, like a tiny, abstract sun. The paint was faded, weathered by salt and time, but the shape was still clear. She let out a tiny breath of amusement. Taggers got everywhere. You saw their marks in rest area bathrooms, under bridges, on the backs of highway signs. The ocean cliffs were no exception. The road curved, taking her between a rock face on the right and empty air on the left. The guardrail gleamed wetly, beads of moisture catching in her beams. The fog closed in tighter on the water side, a thick, luminous wall. Beyond it, nothing. The CB radio was turned low, more habit than necessity. Channel 19 carried a thin wash of distant hollers and laughter, the sound softened by static until it blended into the background. None of it was close enough or clear enough to pull her in. She focused on the rhythm she knew. Steer through the curves, watch the line, check the mirrors, glance at the gauges. The night outside might have been endless, but her tasks came in small, manageable motions. 5 minutes later, another mile marker appeared. Mile 142. The number was the same, upright and uncompromising in black on white. Mara's brow twitched. She told herself she could have misread the first, that a spray of fog on the sign or a flick of light had turned a 141 into a 142 in her mind. She'd been thinking about a podcast she meant to start, about a text from her sister she hadn't answered yet. It was easy to slip into half attention with miles of sameness. Still, she glanced at the concrete base as she passed. There, in the shape of her headlights, was the same small, faded blue symbol. Circle, 3 radiating lines. She took a breath, slow and measured, and let it out through her nose. Could be more than one, she murmured. Artists repeated their marks. Maybe 142 was someone's lucky number. Maybe this stretch of highway had inspired a dozen identical symbols. The GPS did not agree that she was stuck. The little arrow had moved, its position now well beyond where it had been at the last glance. The odometer, too, told a linear story, the digits ticking upward in a sober, unhurried climb. Outside, the fog gave no opinions at all. The road climbed a little, then sank. The guardrail swapped sides as the highway wound around an inlet. On Mara's right now, rock rose up steep and close. On the left, emptiness leaned in, the fog hanging over it like ruffled feathers. The smell of the sea came in pulses through the vents, sharp, clean, with an undercurrent of something deeper and old. It mingled with the scent of the coffee, the faint detergent note of freshly laundered cab curtains, the rubbery tang of hot tires on wet road. The next mile marker emerged from the gray, closer than she expected, as if the fog had hidden it until the last second. Mile 142. Her fingers tightened slightly on the wheel. This time, there was no easy way to blame a trick of the eye. 3 identical markers in a row were a pattern. The blue symbol sat on the concrete base, just as before, the same size, the same degree of fading. The dash clock read 2:07 a.m. The GPS claimed she was nearing mile 150, its mapping oblivious to whatever the roadside. Posts insisted. The CB radio, between drowsy voices, hissed with a brief, clean crackle. Coastal northbound, a voice said, faint but clear. You're riding 142 hard tonight. The tone was calm, worn smooth by long use. Not mocking, not alarmed, observant. Mara reached up automatically and nudged the volume knob higher. Say again, she asked. Northbound on the water, the voice replied. You're still at 142. Don't let it keep you if you don't want to stay. The words given to the numbers made the tiny hairs on her forearms stir. She glanced at the radio, at the small green light that said the unit was alive and listening. Where are you sitting? She asked. You ahead, behind? Beside, the other said. Sort of, hard to say in this soup. The CB's filter blurred the details from the voice. Age, accent, gender. It could have been anyone. It could almost have been her, played back through a thin speaker, flattened and tinned. She thought of one of the driver's superstitions she'd heard in louder diners on quieter afternoons. Stretches of road that wanted you, they'd say. Miles that liked your company too much and tried to keep you. Always said with a grin, a roll of the eyes, as if everyone knew better and no one entirely did. The road curved again, the truck leaning with it. The fog outside her windows unfurled and refolded itself in slow, thoughtful motions. A green sign loomed ahead on the right. Her headlights caught its words as they swam up out of the white. Emergency pullout 1 mile. The arrow beneath pointed ahead, not to any visible lane yet. The fog behind the sign was denser, flatter. Mara nodded once. She used those before on mountain grades to check straps, answer calls, take a breath. They were simple gravel patches carved from rock, usually overlooking something wide and empty. You missed it last time, the CB voice said. Blew right by. It was thicker then. You thought you were fine. She kept her gaze on the road, on the faint twin bands of her headlight beams. The comment sat like a stone at the edge of her thoughts. I've never been up this way in fog, she said. Her logbooks would bear that out. She ran this route a few times a year, usually midday or on clear, cold nights. This kind of smothering marine layer was new. Yeah, the voice said softly. That's what you always say. Something in the way that always landed made the cab feel a degree smaller, the night around it a degree deeper. The road bent left, hugging the contour of the cliff. On her right, the rock face loomed gray and damp, seams glittering where water seeped out of some unseen aquifer. Ahead, the fog was so thick it looked almost solid, like cotton pressed against glass. Her headlights picked out another mile marker, its rectangle a familiar promise. Mile 142. The blue symbol smiled up from the base. Behind it, just beginning to take shape, was a new object, a dark, squat mass crouched against the dip in the rock. As she drew closer, it resolved into one of the emergency pullouts. The shoulder flared into a wide gravel pad, bordered by a low concrete barrier on the ocean side. A signpost marked its beginning, the reflective green face turned toward oncoming traffic. In her beams, she could just make out the words. Emergency pullout, 500 FT. The fog at the far end of the pullout was noticeably thicker, a milky wall into which the pad dissolved. Her hand softened on the wheel. The part of her that measured time, distance, and risk slid forward in her mind, weighing options. She felt alert. The truck hummed smoothly. There was no pressing need to stop, but the sameness of the markers, the insistence of the fog, and the quiet, persistent voice on the radio had begun to stack up in a way she could neither ignore nor rationalize away. Take it if you want off the track, the voice said, gentle now. Ease in, kill your lights. And then what? She asked. Just sit a minute, it replied. Let it go by. She almost asked what it was. The question rose to the back of her tongue, then dissolved. Fog. Time. Whatever part of the road had its fingers wrapped around her bumper. She flicked her blinker on. The ticking filled the cab, intimate and familiar. The truck drifted right, crossing the broken white line with a soft hiss of wet tires. Gravel crunched under her wheels as she rolled into the pullout, the sound different from the uniform hum of asphalt. The concrete barrier on her left appeared in the fringe of her beams, pale and pocked. She eased forward until the truck sat centered in the pad, nose pointed into fog so thick the world looked like it ended 6 feet ahead. Then she stopped, set the brake, and let the engine idle for a moment before turning the key. The sudden quiet was almost physical. The vibrations under her boots ceased. The steering wheel stilled beneath her hands. The only sounds that remained were the ticking of cooling metal and the slow, damp whisper of the fog brushing against the truck's skin. Lights, the voice reminded her, soft and close in the small space. She reached out and turned off her headlights, then her markers. The cab fell into a dim, cave-like glow, lit only by the radio and the faint, greenish numbers on the dash. Outside, the fog became a uniform gray, no longer split by beams. The sense of being in a spotlight faded. She felt instead as if she'd slipped into a pocket in the night where nothing's attention rested overly long. "Now what?" she murmured, less to the radio than to the quiet. "Wait," the voice said, "you'll feel it." She sat, hands resting light on her knees. The cab's small warmth wrapped around her shoulders. Her coffee steamed faintly when she uncapped it. Even that little column of vapor seemed to vanish quicker than usual, folded into the dampness. For a while, there was nothing but the soft tapping of cooling metal and the distant, muffled boom of waves below the cliff. Then slowly something changed. It wasn't sound, not at first. It was pressure. A faint, almost imagined shift in the air, like the sensation you got when a train passed on tracks you couldn't see, the weight of its passing moving through the ground rather than your ears. The truck creaked minutely, as if pushed by a wind she could not feel. The fog outside her side window brightened in a long, low band, as though some huge, diffuse light was sliding by at a distance, its source invisible. For a moment, Mara had the uncanny impression of another lane laid over the one she'd left, of motion doubling back on itself, a version of the highway superimposed on this one, carrying something past that would have intersected her path if she'd stayed where she was. The sensation lasted only a handful of seconds. Then the pressure eased. The invisible weight moved on. The fog settled back into its soft, indifferent drift. The radio was quiet. The mystery voice did not comment. It did not say there. That was it, or see, you remember now. It simply shared the small, still space with her. She sat in the muted glow of her dash lights and listened to her own breathing. The uneasy knot between her shoulder blades slowly unwound. After a while, she wasn't sure how long. Time had taken on a pliable quality tonight. The fog outside her windshield began to pale. Not from the truck's lights. Those were still off. This was a gentler brightening, the slow, inevitable wash of pre-dawn gathering at the horizon and seeping into the low places. Shapes emerged, first as suggestion, then as form. The edge of the pullout, the chipped top of the concrete barrier. Beyond it, the faint, jagged line of the cliff descending to water she still couldn't see but now could almost picture. Mara turned her headlights back on. The beams cut into mist that was no longer a wall but a veil. They reached farther, revealing more of the world. At the far end of the pullout, directly in front of where the truck would have been had she stayed on the highway and not turned off, stood a barricade. 3 thick, orange-and-white striped panels mounted on metal legs, flanked by 2 tall drums with reflective bands. Beyond the barricade, the asphalt dropped away, not in a dramatic, cinematic cliff, but in a blunt, ragged bite where the road had been eaten by something, whether time, an old slide. The remaining edge was crumbled, gravelly, the white shoulder line broken and dangling into nothing. Yellow signs leaned near the ruin, their messages turned away from her. Slowly, she eased the truck forward until she could read the backs, then the faces. Road closed, 500 FT. Use alternate route. In the rising light, she could see where smaller advance warnings had been placed along the shoulder, signs she should have passed earlier, messages that the fog had swallowed whole. It took very little imagination to see a version of the night where she'd driven on through, trusting the GPS's untroubled line, never seeing the barricade until it loomed out of white at the last second. She didn't picture how that might have ended in any detail. She didn't need to. The thought alone made her palms damp against the wheel. Her GPS, now with a clearer view of the sky, beeped. The map redrew itself with a brief flash, recalculating around a thin red triangle that marked the closure she'd just discovered. A detour line appeared, bending away into the inland hills she'd planned to meet later. Mara let out a slow breath. The interior of the cab felt different now, less like a ship in a sea of nothing and more like what it had always been. A control room moving through a real, flawed, changeable world. She reached up and thumbed the CB mic off its cradle. "Appreciate the heads -up," she said. Her voice sounded a bit rough, like it had been waiting too long to speak. "Whoever you are." Static breathed in her ear. For a moment, she thought she heard the faint echo of another voice layered under her own, like a recording of her words played back half a second late. Then it was gone. "You'll remember next time," the mystery voice said at last, far away and close in the same instant. "Or you won't, but maybe you'll listen sooner." Then the channel filled with the ordinary clutter of other runs. Someone complaining about a closed diner, another driver asking about chain laws in a distant pass. The peculiar, focused attention that had seemed trained on her alone eased away. She flicked the mic back into place. The sun, somewhere beyond the thickening gray, thought about rising. The fog that had been so oppressive all night now began to glow softly, the first hints of daylight turning it a luminous pearl. Mara backed the truck carefully out of the pullout, then turned it toward the way the GPS indicated, a road angling inland, away from the water. Trees emerged from the mist as she climbed, their trunks dark, their leaves beaded with moisture. The smell of salt faded, replaced by damp earth and fir needles. On the passenger seat, her logbook lay open, pen resting in its crease. At the next straight stretch, she reached over and wrote in neat, precise letters. 2:15 a.m., fog heavy near MM 142. Emergency pullout saved my hide. Don't trust the map when the road says otherwise. She paused, then added beneath it with a faint, wry smile. If you feel like you're driving the same mile twice, maybe you are. Stop and let it pass. Outside, as she pulled away from the cliffs, the last of the coastal fog clung stubbornly below, draped over the lost piece of road like a curtain dropped between acts. Whatever version of the night had wanted to play out down there could keep its secrets. Up here, the sky was slowly changing color, and the miles ahead, for all their unknowns, felt straightforward again, measured in honest markers and the quiet confidence of a truck moving toward morning. Story number 6. The industrial plain at night was a flat, dark sheet, and Nikhil Wright's truck ran across it like a slow, determined seam stitch. Out here, between the low smudge of one city and the ghostly glow of another, there was nothing much to see even on a clear evening. A few factory silhouettes, the spaced hyphen-out wink of red lights atop communication towers, the occasional cluster of sodium lamps around a lonely intersection. Tonight, even that sparse geography had been taken away. A river not far from the highway had breathed out ground fog, thick and strangely heavy, until it spilled across the fields and swallowed the road. It lay ankle-high in some places, waist-high in others, and then suddenly it would fling itself over the cab, turning the world into a softly lit blank. The truck's headlights pushed through it in twin tunnels that never quite reached as far as his instincts wanted. Inside the cab, the world was small and warm and knowable. The dashboard glowed in amber and green, needles hovering where they should. The vents issued a faint, continuous stream of warm air scented with dust, and the last traces of the fast-food meal he'd eaten 3 hours before. His thermos sat between the seats, metal warm when his fingers brushed it, a quiet assurance that there was still hot coffee to be had whenever he decided he needed it. The clock on the dash read 3:11. His logbook on the passenger seat was unspectacular, a neat march of times and mile markers that said he was on schedule within his hours and well on his way to the distribution center at the far edge of the next city. The GPS on the windshield, its screen dimmed for night, showed his little arrow moving along a straight line of interstate. No curves of note, no exits worth attention, just a long, even stretch through the flat lands. The CB radio on the overhead console murmured quietly with distant talk, someone 100 miles away grumbling about a closed ramp, another driver joking about bad coffee. None of it felt close. Nikhil had the volume down, more comforted by the hiss of static than by the words themselves. The fog pressed closer. His high beams only made the whiteness brighter, nearer, more impenetrable, so he kept the lights low, preferring the honest reach of a shorter beam to the blinding wall of reflected glow. The center line rose to meet him in neat white segments, then vanished under the truck's nose. Reflectors on the right shoulder winked like sleepy eyes. Beyond that, the world had withdrawn. Somewhere unseen off to the side, a train horn sounded once, long and low, then faded. The note floated over the flat land and softened in the fog, a reminder that other machines moved through the dark as faithfully as his did. Ahead, a sign shouldered its way out of the white. In the truck's lights, its bright orange face shone wetly, raindrops, or was it just condensate, beating on the reflective surface? Road work ahead. 10 miles. Nikhil's hands tightened on the wheel a fraction. Roadwork zones at night weren't unusual, but they asked for a different kind of attention, a narrower focus, a readiness to obey cones and arrows and speed limits that sometimes changed without much warning. In fog like this, the idea of detours and narrowed lanes brought a small, instinctive knot of wariness to his chest. He eased his speed down a hair. The cruise control clicked off with a soft note, returning full control to his foot. The truck responded with its usual, patient wait. 10 miles, he said quietly as if the road could hear him. Plenty of time. The sign slipped back into the mist, its fluorescent orange fading, leaving behind only the impression of a color. The next few miles were a small, private world of gray and white and red and green. The hum of the tires under the cab changed subtly with different seams in the pavement. The fog thinned and thickened in a slow, breathing rhythm. Once or twice, he glimpsed the faint suggestion of a billboard far out in the mess, its message unreadable, its edges eaten by moisture. The CB clicked softly. "Road ahead's all barrels and blinkers tonight," a voice said, faint but clear. "Northbound, you take her slow." No call sign, no chatter around the remark. The tone was matter of fact, the way seasoned drivers talked when they weren't interested in dramatics. It could have been meant for anyone on this side of the interstate, or it could have been meant for him alone. He glanced at the radio, then back at the road. "Appreciate it," he said into the mic, thumb pressing the talk button out of habit. "What mile you at calling that?" Static answered, then the muffled sound of some distant conversation on another channel cut in briefly and faded. No one replied directly. The GPS showed his little arrow approaching an unlabeled gray rectangle that overlapped the mainline, a generic representation of a construction zone. He must have missed the software update that would have given it more detail. The device didn't show lane closures, just a shaded patch over the digital road. Another sign appeared ahead, this one closer, its orange brighter. "Road work ahead. 5 miles. Lights from some unseen source pulsed behind the fog out there, steady amber flashes that teased the edges of his vision and then disappeared. The aurora of a distant aero board, maybe, or the pulsing strobes of a dot truck. He took a sip from his thermos. The coffee was still hot, still bitter enough to remind him he was awake. The warmth moved down into his chest, a small counterpoint to the cooling world beyond the glass. At 3 miles out, he began to see the first cheeky scouts of the work zone, a single traffic cone on the shoulder, then another. Their orange bodies looked almost crimson in his headlights. Moisture beaded on their sides like sweat. A portable message board emerged from the fog a moment later, its black panel blank. Either the bulbs were off or the message had not yet been set. Then came the sign he'd been half expecting. Road work ahead. 1 mile. Left lane closed. Here we go, he murmured. He signaled, the soft tick of the blinker loud in the cocoon of the cab, and eased into the right lane. The truck moved obediently. The trailer followed, a long, shadowy shape in his mirrors, its marker lights soft and red and vaguely unreal in the fog. The left lane began to acquire cones, orange shapes standing in serious little rows. Their black bases spread slightly where they met the wet asphalt. They thickened gradually until they made a solid line, herding him and any unseen followers into the right. The first arrow board appeared, a big, rectangular panel on a trailer, its amber lights flashing a steady pattern, instructing traffic to merge right. The arrows seemed strangely bright and distant at the same time, their glow soaked and diffused by the moisture. He saw no other vehicles ahead, no brake lights, no drifting beams of headlights, only the disciplined procession of cones and the patient blinking of managed light. As he rolled fully into the single open lane, the sensation of being in a corridor intensified. To his left, a forest of barrels and cones. To his right, the vague rise of the shoulder, the faint suggestion of a ditch, then emptiness beyond. Above, a low, undifferentiated roof of fog, the world compressed. More signs. Speed limit 45. FINES doubled in work zone. He obeyed without thinking, letting the truck's speed bleed down, the weight of the loaded trailer pushing gently against the engine brake. He expected at any moment to see workers, reflective vests, flashlights, figures moving around big machines idle for the night, or men beside trucks, drinking coffee from styrofoam cups. Even if the heavy work were scheduled for daylight, there was usually someone. There was no one. The machines were there, big, dark shapes hunched in the fog beyond the cones. Rollers, backhoes, a grader. Their metal skins were slick with moisture. Some wore strips of caution tape that fluttered listlessly in the invisible air. Light towers stood among them, tops glowing with sodium lamps that poured their sickly yellow onto equipment and mist, but there were no shadows cross-hatching those beams. No motion disturbed the pools. Nikhil's truck moved down the lane in the center of that long, illuminated culvert. The sense of being watched, not by eyes but by objects, by barrels, by arrow boards, by machines waiting for hands to work them, settled in slowly. The CB hissed. Northbound coming through again, a different voice said, slightly muffled, as if picked up on some other frequency bleeding into his. Yeah, I see him, another voice replied. He'll hit the pinch in about 5. Nikhil's right hand tightened reflexively on the wheel. He didn't recognize these voices. They didn't sound like drivers. There was a clipped, workaday rhythm to them, the kind he associated with foremen, with crews talking on handhelds. He reached for the CB, checked the display. Channel 19, the usual. Construction ahead, you boys on a different channel, he asked, trying to make his tone light. You're bleeding over on 19. No answer. The radio slipped back into static, then into the faraway murmur of someone else's song. He passed a sign that read, Road work next 2 miles. The distance felt longer than that already, but fog warped perception. He'd driven through zones that seemed endless only to find, when he checked the odometer later, that they'd been shorter than he thought. The next few minutes stretched. Cones, barrels, machines, light towers, no people. He watched the white lines on the pavement, the inside stripe hugging the divider of barrels, the outside line near the shoulder. Their rhythm was steady, unbroken. No odd gaps, no misalignments that would tell him he was passing the same stretch twice. Still, a strange familiarity crept in. That particular pattern of cracked asphalt there. That small pothole filled in with darker tar. That left-leaning cone with a dent midway up its body. Northbound, you're drifting, the first anonymous voice said quietly over the speakers. His hands snapped back to the wheel from where they'd been about to reach for his coffee. He shifted a few inches toward the line of barrels without realizing it. "Eyes up," the second voice added, not unkindly. "Fog's playing tricks. Stay dead center." He did, lining his hood ornament up between the faint stripes like a sight. The cab shuddered softly as the road surface changed for a few feet, then smoothed again. He passed under a gantry sign half shrouded in fog. The reflective green panel showed only one legible thing in his headlights before it slid away. Exit 64, 1 mile. The arrows beneath were blurred by moisture. He checked the GPS. His digital arrow floated near an unlabeled gray patch, miles from any marked exit. The device, deprived of a clear signal by the low clouds and the light tower's electrical noise, had lost some of its precision. Its estimated position dot wobbled slightly on the line. The next sign came into view sooner than he expected. Exit 64, 1 mile. Same font, same spacing, same small smear of dirt on the X, catching the light differently. A prickle ran along his shoulders. He told himself he could be wrong. 2 exits, both numbered 64, serving different roads, not uncommon in some states. Or maybe the first had been 63 and his eyes, lulled by repetition and fog, had made it what they expected. Then he saw the cone with the dent halfway up its body, leaning just left of center. The tiny, ludicrously specific detail anchored the feeling of repetition. His foot eased off the throttle without his permission. "How long's this zone supposed to be?" he asked the cab, the fog, the radio. "No longer than it has to," one of the unseen voices replied. He swallowed. "You in the work trucks?" he asked. "You got a sign out here says how far?" "Static." He glanced at the CB. The small signal strength meter flickered as if someone were transmitting and releasing, just on the edge of range. The sign he'd just passed loomed again ahead, impossibly soon. Exit 64, 1 mile. This time there was no plausible denial. He watched the same faint streak of paint, the same bent corner on the bottom left, the same angle of tilt on the supporting post. He'd driven in a straight, narrow lane, hemmed in by cones and barrels, with no room to have turned or circled, and yet here he was. He felt his heartbeat tick faster, a heavy pulse under his sternum. "This isn't funny," he said, not sure who he was addressing. "Never was," came the soft answer through the speaker. "You just weren't looking at it the first time." He reeled his attention back from the fog and the impossible sign, and forced it onto the immediate. The road in front of his bumper, the lane, the markers. The truck continued on, its engine note unchanged, its speed steady. He tried to track distance by the odometer. The small numbers marched upward in tenths. 1 mile, 2. Still cones, still barrels, still machines waiting in the fog. Somewhere in that blur, a sign whispered past. "Road work next 2 miles. He had seen that exact phrasing already. But then, many work zones used the same templates. His mind could be collecting familiar bits and stitching them into loops. The strange voices, though, that was harder to file away. "Who are you?" he asked the radio, his voice lower now. For a while, only the fog answered, brushing softly along the mirrors, murmuring on the cab's skin. Then so quietly he almost missed it. "Crew, sort of. You could say we're on the long-term project." There was a faint smile in the words, but it didn't land as mockery. "What project?" he pushed. "Keeping people moving who'd otherwise stop in the wrong place," another voice said. "Or the wrong one." Nick Hill let out a soft, breathy laugh that surprised him. It sounded more like a shiver escaping. "You're saying this is what, some kind of time-saving detour?" he asked. "A foggy bypass nobody told the dot about." "Something like that," the first voice said. "You'd already hit this stretch once. Took the exit when you shouldn't have. Didn't see the signs. Lot of fog that night, too." He felt the memory like something he'd brushed against in a dream. A long shift, thicker fog, an arrow board pointing to a ramp that looked clearer than the main line. The idea of getting out of the mess just for a bit. A choice made in a second, forgotten as soon as the next mile came. "You don't remember," the second voice added, no accusation in it. "Most don't. That's what the zone for." Another sign came out of the blank ahead. This one was different, diamond-shaped yellow. "Lane shift ahead." Under it, a squat, glowing arrow board blinked. Its pattern was odd, not the usual right or left forcings, but a kind of chevron pointing straight through its center, as if the lane itself would kink and bend, but the path should remain aligned. The cones thickened. Their line to the left curved inward, then outward, guiding the lane around some unseen obstacle. To the right, the shoulder fell away into a darkness the fog only hinted at. He followed the arrow's suggestion, guiding the truck along the narrow channel. "Last time you followed the flashers," the first voice said, almost conversational. "The one set up wrong took you right into it." "Into what?" Nikhil asked, though part of him was no longer sure he wanted the answer. "Into before," the second replied. "Into a night that was already over." The sense of being in two places at once crept in. In this cab, in this moment, hands on this familiar wheel, and also somewhere beside that, running the same lane but with little differences. Speed a hair too high, fatigue a hair worse, attention wandering for just a second. He thought of all the near misses he knew he'd had. The deer that had chosen the ditch instead of the road, the drunk driver who'd swerved back into his own lane at the last second, the black ice patch he'd skated across but not spun on. How many times, he wondered, had he almost not made the right choice? How many times had something, instinct, luck, grace, steered him back? "Why me?" he asked softly. "Why tonight?" "Because you were paying enough attention to feel it this time," one of the unseen work crew said. "And because the fog's thick and the miles hungry, we get a say now and then." Ahead, through the blur of cones and amber light, something shifted. The pattern of reflectors changed. The monotonous orange broke with the promise of white. An end road work sign emerged, its black letters almost startling in their simplicity. He felt a temptation to laugh, to ease up, to surge forward toward that psychological finish line. Instead, his foot stayed where it was, letting the truck stay steady. "Not yet," the quiet voice warned, gentle but firm. "That one's for later. Yours is the next." It made no sense. There, plain as day in his headlights, was the end of the zone, the cones peeling away, the dark mouth of the open interstate beyond. But as he watched, the sign's edges wavered, like a reflection in disturbed water. The fog behind it thickened, swallowing the point where lane markings should have picked up again. His attention skated sideways. On the right-hand side, just beyond the shoulder, another signpost waited in the gloom. No sign hung from it yet, just the bare metal uprights, thin and patient. "When you see the post with nothing on it, that's yours," the first voice said. "Don't be in a hurry for the wrong finish line. You already took that one once." He eased the truck's speed down another notch, the engine brake purring. The end road work sign slid by on his left, its letters warping as if viewed through rippled glass. Up close, for the fraction of a second that it was parallel to his cab, he saw that the sheet of metal was bent in on itself slightly, the panel creased like paper, as though something heavy had struck it from the rear. Then it was gone, swallowed in white. The road stayed lined with cones. 50 yards ahead, the naked signpost on the right rose out of the fog. Tall, silver, empty. Beyond it, the cone line finally broke. The barrels thinned. The open interstate appeared, its dual lanes dark and clean and blessedly wide. He felt the rightness of it in his bones, the way you felt when a puzzle piece clicked into place after you tried all the wrong ones. The steering wheel vibrated under his hands with the subtle change in surface as he rolled out of the narrow channel and back onto the main line. He passed the bare post. For a heartbeat, he could have sworn he saw, at the edge of his vision, faint, ghosted shapes hanging on it, translucent words that never quite resolved into letters before the truck carried him past. Then at last, another end roadwork sign appeared. Its panel was unbent. The cones vanished in its wake. The arrow boards were behind him, their glow dimming in his mirrors until they were just soft, pooling smears of amber swallowed by gray. His speed crept back up to the limit. The truck's engine note returned to its usual, contented hum. The GPS, as if shaken awake, recalculated. The little arrow jumped slightly, then settled firmly on the bright digital line. The gray construction zone patch vanished from the map, replaced by clean highway. On the CB, the work-crew voices faded, replaced entirely by the ordinary sprawl of chatter. Someone was complaining about a way station hours away. Another driver asked about the weather in a different state. No one spoke about fog or miles that looped or exits that led into before. Nikhil drove on. The fog began, gradually, to thin. The moisture that had risen from the river was losing its fight with the dry air above. The white blanket shredded into patches, then into threads. The first weak hint of dawn smudged the eastern horizon, turning the black into a deep, textured blue. He checked the dash clock. 3:14 a.m. He blinked. He could have sworn he'd been in the work zone for longer than 3 minutes. The odometer, on the other hand, told a different story. He'd gone 6 miles in that stretch, maybe 7, at the reduced speed. The math didn't object. Only his bones did. On the passenger seat, his logbook lay open, pen resting in its spine. At the next straight, clear run, he reached over and noted the time, the construction, the mile where it had started as best as he could recall. 3:14 a.m., heavy fog, long work zone near 64. Follow cones, not instincts. He hesitated, then wrote beneath it in smaller hand. If you see the same sign twice, slow down. Someone might be trying to help. The words looked oddly plain on the page. Someone, reading them later, would probably assume he meant a state trooper, a flagger, an official. He wasn't sure he didn't mean that himself. The radio, the voices, the looping signs, they could be the work of a tired mind, making patterns where none existed. And yet, as the fog tore itself into tatters and the sky thought about color, he felt, just for a moment, that he wasn't alone in the cab. Not in the unsettling way of being watched, but in the quieter sense of being part of a longer chain of decisions and corrections that stretched back and forward along the same roads. Out here in the small hours, highways remembered things. Mist held onto shapes long after they'd gone. Cones and signs waited in their metal silence to be read, re-read, misread, and sometimes, finally, seen for what they were. Behind him, somewhere in the lifting fog over the industrial plain, a cluster of dark shapes, machines, barrels, light towers, sat quiet. Whether a crew would arrive with the sunrise to set them in motion, or whether they'd dissolve with the last of the mist, the highway would never say. Nikhil drove toward the brightening edge of the world, his truck a small, steady constant between the spent night and the coming day. The hum of the engine, a low, contented line drawn through whatever mysteries the long miles chose to lay at his feet.